Their works are the works of iniquity, and the act of violence is in their hands. Their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed innocent blood. Their thoughts are thoughts of iniquity, wasting and destruction are in their paths. The way of peace they know not, and there is no judgment in their goings. They have made them crooked paths. Whosoever goeth therein shall not know peace.
The event that began to unfold in France in 1789 gave a profoundly new meaning to the notion of revolution, a meaning that has transformed world history and touched the lives of all nations. If America too has been a century of revolutions, this is because men and women throughout the world have continued to play out, in one way or another, that script for modern politics invented by the Illuminati, implemented in France in 1789. Not only the modern notion of revolution itself, but the United States' contemporary political vocabulary, the distinction between right and left, the notions of nationalism, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, even their modern understanding of democracy and human rights derived directly or indirectly from the French Revolution. 2 centuries later, in the bicentennial year of the French Revolution, we find ourselves still confronted by the challenge of understanding the meaning and implications of its extraordinary events.
By knowing this history and the working of the Order of the Illuminati in it, you can be able to more easily detect the various organizational front groups whom the Order is now working through to bring about world revolution, even though these groups do not call themselves the Illuminati or even admit that they are connected with them. So when President Bush talks about forging a new world order, you can know exactly what he is really talking about and what he is really working towards today, the very same plan and goal of the Illuminati since the French Revolution.
Adam Weishaupt was born February 6, 1748 at Ingolstadt, Bavaria. Even though Adam Weishaupt was born of Jewish ancestors, his family converted to Catholicism. Weishaupt was educated by the Jesuits. The Jesuits is an order with their own mystery. He purportedly developed an intense hatred for the Jesuits, and he became an occultist. Weishaupt, despite his hatred of them, admired their Jesuit tactics, discipline, and skill at organization, their ability and their devotion to their cause. Since Jesuits educated Weishaupt, he was familiar with their experiences of creating totalitarian societies, and his prototype was above all the totalitarian and theocratic rule. The Order of the Illuminati was created on May 1st, 1776, also known as May Day, which is a sacred holiday to the pagan religion. It is also a major holiday to most modern communists. The year 1776 also has some note in history. It was the year that the American Declaration of Independence was created. The Illuminati became known as the Perfectibilists, the Freethinkers, and the Enlightened Ones, because they too were anti-Christian rationalists or humanists who considered all religions to be false. Weishaupt was an ardent student of French philosopher Voltaire. It is believed that, as a result of Voltaire's writings, Weishaupt formulated his ideas concerning the destruction of the church. Weishaupt also adopted the teachings of radical French philosophers such as Rousseau and other anti-Christian doctrines. He founded a secret group of like-minded individuals who called themselves Illuminati, or bearers of light. As the name implies, those individuals who are members of the Illuminati possesses the light of Lucifer. As far as they are concerned, only members of the human race who possesses the light of Lucifer are truly enlightened and capable of governing. The group's ideology appears to have been based on a random mixing of Rosicrucianism, Kabbalistic mysticism, Jesuit organization, and even Masonry, which itself appears to have elements of Egyptian mysticism and Babylonian cosmology.
While an undergraduate, Weishaupt studied the ancient pagan religions and was familiar with the Eleusinian mysteries and the theories of the Greek mystic Pythagoras. As a student, he had drafted the constitution for a secret society modeled on the pagan mystery schools, but it was not until he was initiated into Freemasonry that Weishaupt's plan for the ultimate secret society was spawned.
This process of enlightening meant an elimination of Christianity and placing Illuminati leaders in charge of governments around the world. Most of his beliefs are now being enacted by modern-day leftists. The first effort by the Illuminati to form a one-world government was the provocation of the French Revolution. The oath of submission is taken by the candidate for the membership as follows.
I bind myself to perpetual silence and unshaken loyalty and submission to the order in the persons of my superiors, here making a faithful and complete surrender of my private judgment, my own will, and every narrow-minded employment of my power and influence. I pledge myself to account the good of the order as my own, and am ready to serve it with my fortune, my honor, and my blood. Should I, through admission, neglect, passion, or wickedness, behave contrary to this good of the order, I subject myself to what reproof and punishment my superiors shall enjoin. The friends and the enemies of my order shall be my friends and enemies, and with respect to both, I will conduct myself as directed by the order, and am ready in every lawful way to devote myself to its increase and promotion, and therein to employ all my ability. All this I promise and protest without secret reservation, according to the intention of the society which require from me this engagement. This I do as I am, and as I hope to continue, a man of honor.
In 1785, an Illuminati courier named Lance is struck by lightning and killed while traveling by horseback through the town of Ratisbon. When Bavarian officials examined the contents of his saddlebags, they discovered the existence of the Order of the Illuminati and find plans detailing the coming French Revolution. Des Griffin, an author with great insight into what surrounded this event, said,
Public attention was first drawn to the existence of the Illuminati and their diabolical plan for world conquest as a result of a bizarre accident in 1785. History records that a man named Lanz, an Illuminati courier, was racing on horseback from Frankfurt to Paris, carrying documents relating to Illuminati activities in general, and specific instructions for the planned French Revolution in particular. The documents originated with Jewish members of the Illuminati in Germany and were addressed to the Grand Master of the Grand Orient Masons in Paris. As the courier galloped through Ratisbon, he was struck by lightning and killed. All the papers he was carrying fell into the hands of the local police and were turned over to the Bavarian government. The authorities ordered the police to raid the headquarters of the Illuminati. This resulted in additional documents being captured. The carefully documented evidence was brought to the attention of the various governments in Europe. For one reason or another, possibly Illuminati influence, they chose to turn a deaf ear to the warnings contained in these dreadful documents. 4 years later, the French Revolution exploded on the European scene in all its hideous fury.
The Bavarian government attempts to alert the government of France of impending disaster, but the French government fails to heed this warning. Bavarian officials arrest all members of the Illuminati they can find, but Weishaupt and others have gone underground and cannot be found. The original writings of the order and sect of the Illuminati was an official report issued by the Bavarian government in February 6, 1786, following a lengthy investigation. Professor John Robinson and Jesuit priest Abbe Barul has quoted the Illuminati document extensively in their best-selling books. Ted Flynn wrote about the importance of Robinson's work in pinpointing the real culprits directing the French Revolution.
Crucial inside information on the Illuminati came when these great intellectuals were foolish enough to invite a professor by the name of John Robison to join their ranks. Robison, professor of natural philosophy at Edinburgh University, was also Secretary General of the prestigious Royal Society in that Scottish city. He was recognized by his contemporaries as one of the truly great intellectuals of his day. By inviting Robison to join his conspirators, Weishaupt probably felt that the British professor would prove to be a link in expanding his organization into the British Isles. Weishaupt completely misjudged Robison's character. Instead of finding a person with billowing vanity, tremendous self-esteem, and an insatiable lust for power, he discovered a man of great integrity a man deeply concerned for the welfare of his fellow human beings and for his own country in particular. Robison sought that which was honorable for the English people and would not be deceived. Robison didn't fall for the lie that the goals of the Illuminati were pure and honorable. He kept his reactions to himself and played along with the conspirators. As a result, he was entrusted with top-secret Illuminati documents and was able to scrutinize the inner workings of the secret society at close range. Thus, Professor Robison wrote a startling book entitled Proofs of a Conspiracy, which was published in 1797.
Researcher Mark Dice said the following of the importance of Abbe Barul's research into the mysterious workings of the Illuminati.
In 1797, a French Jesuit priest named Abbé Barul published a series of books on the Jacobins and their influence on the French Revolution. Barul wrote 4 different volumes titled Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism, in which he explained that the French Revolution was the result of secret societies, largely the Bavarian Illuminati. 2 of the volumes focus extensively on Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati, and Barul's writings remain important today because they were written at the time Weishaupt and his cohorts were discovered and had their plans exposed to the world.
Denouncing God, Weishaupt and his followers considered themselves to be the cream of the intelligentsia, the only people with the mental capacity, the knowledge, the insight and understanding necessary to govern the world and bring it peace. Weishaupt, financed by Rothschild, had begun infiltrating the well-established Continental Order of Freemasons with their satanical doctrine. Weishaupt stated,
"The great strength of our order lies in its concealment. Let it never appear in any place in its own name, but always covered by another name and another occupation. None is fitter than the 3 lower degrees of Freemasonry. The public is accustomed to it, expects little from it, and therefore takes little notice of it."
In order to stay hidden from the vast population, Weishaupt and his co-conspirators selected for themselves code names. Adam Weishaupt used the code name Spartacus, the gladiator who rose up against Rome. Mirabeau, an influential writer and thinker, as well as one of the most important figures in the early revolutionary period, was an initiate to Illuminism. He became personally acquainted with both Weishaupt and his close associate Baron Kniga, who inducted him into the mysteries of the order. In his landmark historical study of modern revolutionary movements, Fire in the Minds of Men, James Billington leaves little doubt as to the pivotal role of Weishaupt's Illuminism, not only in the French Revolution, but in later revolutionary movements as well.
Mirabeau's work distinguished rationalistic Illuminists from mystical occultists, hailing the former as leaders of a movement the great aim of which was the improvement of the present system of governments and legislations. Mirabeau took much of his new totalistic concept of the revolution directly from Illuminists' models. He almost certainly transmitted something of this ideal to his influential protégés, Camille Desmoulins and Étienne Dumont. As early as May 10, 1789, he wrote to the constituents who had elected him to the Third Estate that the purpose of the Estates General was not to reform, but to regenerate the nation. He subsequently called the National Assembly the inviolable priesthood of national policy, the Declaration of the Rights of Man a political gospel, and the Constitution of 1791 a new religion for which the people are ready to die.
The Illuminati follows 7 main goals as we saw in Volume 1.
1. Abolition of all national governments. 2. Abolition of all religions except Satanism. 3. Abolition of the family. 4. Abolition of private property. 5. Abolition of inheritance by high inheritance taxes. 6. Abolition of patriotism. 7. Creation of the world government under the United Nations controlled by the Illuminati.
To truly understand the French Revolution, one must look beyond the facade of democracy and the natural rights of man to calculate the design of those shadowy figures whose true revolutionary goals were hidden from public scrutiny. Conventional history informs us of the swirl of conspiracies and subversive factions in revolutionary France. The Orleanists, the Jacobins, the Girondists, the Montagnards, the Thermidorians, and others of lesser significance. But it is to Weishaupt's Illuminati that we must look for the common subversive thread that imparted vitality to these more superficial movements.
Illuminism in reality is less an order than a principle, and a principle which can work better under cover of something else. Weishaupt himself had laid down the precept that the work of Illuminism could best be conducted under other names and other occupations, and henceforth we shall always find it carried on by this skillful system of camouflage.
Webster made an important point when she said that the order of the Illuminati is based on certain principles. Many historians think that the Illuminati died out when they fled from the Bavarian government. They are greatly misled by Satan, who is still alive working his diabolical principles with much success. The Jacobin Club, which was the radical nucleus of the French Revolutionary movement, was founded by Illuminized Freemasons.
The Paris Jacobins, who had no less than 1,200 members by 1790, set the standards of rhetoric, agitation, and ceremony for the clubs in the provinces, many of which had hundreds of members. The clubs became incubators for theorizing and political activism of a strongly moralistic type. They combined features of a school, a debating society, a political organization, and a church. Their egalitarianism and denunciation of the existing political and social order became increasingly radical. The Jacobins made sharp rhetorical attacks on what were regarded as conspiracies against the people. The Jacobins saw themselves as virtuous champions of a great moral cause and is joined by fraternity and solidarity. They were guardians of revolutionary principles. They were ushering in a new way of life, a society of equality and democracy, a glorious goal that permitted no mercy for those who stood in the way. Jacobinism inspired the French Revolution's murderous hatred of traditional elites, its reign of terror, and its messianic ambitions.
The political terms, right and left, were born in the French Revolution when two revolutionary factions took seat in the French National Assembly's hall, the Girondins on the right wing and the Jacobins on the left wing. Those on the left were the radicals who proudly adopted the designation as a symbol of their revolutionary defiance of Christian tradition. Left-wing ideologues dominate the information media today, some under the cover of neoconservatism. Harold Quigley, a highly respected professor of history at the Foreign Service School of Georgetown University for 28 years and was a mentor of former President Bill Clinton, Quigley revealed in his 1,348-page magnum opus, Tragedy and Hope. Professor Quigley was a globalist. He supported the idea of the New World Order and wrote about it. He, unlike the elites, thought the people should know about it. In page 1247, regarding the two parties, left versus right system, or the sham we call today democracy, Quigley stated,
In American politics, we have several parties included under the blanket words Democratic and Republican. The argument that the two parties should represent opposed ideals and policies, one perhaps of the right and the other of the left, is a foolish idea acceptable only to the doctrinaire and academic thinkers. Instead, the two parties should be almost identical, so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extreme shifts in policy.
Unlike the Jacobins, the Girondins, who shared the ideology of English liberalism, supported freedom of religion and the equality of all churches and religious movements, abolishing the privileges and the official status of the Catholic Church as the state religion. Their views were religious in essence, deeply influenced by the Bible, the Greek philosophers, and the Freemasons. The Jacobins are often confused with the Montagnards of Marat, Danton, and Robespierre, and the Girondins as a separate party. In fact, they were factions within the same party. The Girondins, a faction of the Jacobins, owed what little leadership they had to Jacques-Pierre Brusseau. As most of the numbers were Jacobins, they were also radical Democrats. They forced King Louis XVI to form a government from their faction in 1792. A convention was called to draw up a new constitution, and from 1792 to 95, the Committee of Public Safety ruled ruled France while the Constitution was set aside. The power of this committee did not come from the convention, but from the Radical Jacobin Club. Its members in the convention were known as the Mountain, from the high seats they occupied in the Legislative Assembly Hall. The Montagnard-led mob intimidated the convention, which ordered the arrest of 30 Girondins leaders in 1793. Some of the arrested Girondins escaped, including Brissot, and fled to the provinces in an attempt to raise the countryside against Paris. This threat of civil war was all the excuse the Illuminati needed to begin the terror. After the fall of the Montagnards and the destruction of the Girondins, whatever moderate influence that remained in the French Revolution was gone, the result of the infamous Reign of Terror of September 5th, 1793 to July 28th, 1794. Their intentions was to change the regime from an absolute monarchy to a constitutional parliamentarian one, much like the English model, abolishing the excessive privileges of the upper classes.
All doors, or nearly so, of La Gironde itself were shut against the Girondists, and they wandered outcasts in the country, suffering every extremity of toil and hunger, and bringing in some cases death upon the friends who ventured to afford them refuge. About 42 of the Girondist deputies perished by the guillotine, by suicide, or by the fatigue of their wanderings. About 24 escaped these perils, and after many and various sufferings, recalled to the convention when the Jacobin influence was destroyed. The Girondists well realized the danger that had threatened them, and therefore, after condoning the massacres, ended by denouncing them. But if they now deprecated the reign of anarchy, it was principally because they saw the movement they had helped to produce turning against themselves, and the abyss into which they had precipitated the monarchy yawning beneath their own feet.
Germany helped the revolution directly with Prussia King Frederick the Great's political machinations, and indirectly with the ideology of Weishaupt. The Grand Constitutions of the Ancient Rite of 1786 were issued in the name of Frederick the Great of Prussia as titular head of the Rite.
Frederick the Great was certainly a Mason. The Livre d'Or, the Supreme Council of France, contains a similar statement but with more minute details. It says that on the 1st of May, 1786, Frederick II, King of Prussia, caused the high degrees and Masonic constitutions of the ancient rite to be revived. He added 8 degrees to the 25 already recognized in Prussia and founded a Supreme Council of 33 degrees, of which he himself constructed the regulations in 18 articles.
Frederick had long admired Voltaire and his ideas about the age of reason. Frederick considered him a personal friend, and wherever the king was, Voltaire could be found close by. Count Cagliostro was an Italian mystic. Behind the scenes, Comte Cagliostro played a leading role in the revolution. Born in Sicily, his real name was Joseph Balsamo, a member of the Illuminati and of the classical lodges in Germany. He was chosen to be one of the agents entrusted with the mission of disseminating radical and revolutionary ideas across Europe, preparing the ground for the eventual French Revolution. The importance of Cagliostro cannot be overstated when it comes to Masonry and the Illuminati. 33rd degree Mason Albert Markey, Arthur Waite, and Grand Master Luciferian Albert Pike emphasized this when they said,
"To write the history of Masonry in the 18th century and to leave out Cagliostro would be like enacting the play of Hamlet and leaving out the part of the Prince of Denmark." Cagliostro was the agent of the Templars and therefore wrote to the Freemasons of London that the time had come to begin the work of rebuilding the Temple of the Eternal. He had introduced into Masonry a new rite called the Egyptian and endeavored to resuscitate the mysterious worship of Isis. He, Cagliostro, enchanted the most enlightened and philosophical society in the most philosophical and enlightened country of the world, just past its zenith of cultured unbelief. He is said to have been made a Mason in London at an apparently mythical lodge under completely mythical circumstances, and he appears to have been a visitor at various English lodges. But his crowning ambition was to inaugurate a mother lodge at Paris, to which Masonry should be subordinated entirely, and for this purpose he proclaimed himself the bearer of the mysteries of Isis and Anubis from the Far East.
At the end of his European tour, he went to France and became a Jacobin. At the Grand Masonic Congress in 1785, he received new orders for preparing for the revolution. In the same year, Cagliostro was the focal point of the diamond necklace affair, making the queen the victim of a conspiracy devised to give the impression that she had a love affair with a cardinal. Among the people, this irreparably dented the reputations of both the church and the monarchy.
Bitterness with the monarchy in France was further fueled when the propaganda machine announced that the Queen had bought a diamond necklace for £250,000, when in truth it had been ordered without her knowledge by an agent of the Brotherhood, a close associate of Adam Weishaupt. This was political dynamite at a time of such poverty in France. The scheme was organized by Joseph Balsamo, an Italian from Palermo, who was initiated into the Illuminati by Weishaupt.
The necromancer was acquitted after having been in prison for more than a year in the Bastille. He was afterwards banished from France by order of Louis XVI. Cagliostro in 1785 and again in 1790 revealed his knowledge of the plan to overthrow France. A respected Masonic authority said,
On May 10, 1785, Cagliostro attended the Masonic conference called for that purpose, and his power and simplicity immediately won for him the favorable opinion of the entire gathering. Cagliostro foretold in detail the horrors of the coming revolution and the fall of the monarchy, describing minutely the fate of the various members of the royal family. He also prophesied the advent of Napoleon and the rise of the First Empire. All this he did to demonstrate that which can be accomplished by superior knowledge. Later, when arrested and sent to the Bastille, Cagliostro wrote on the wall of his cell the following cryptic message, which when interpreted reads, "In 1789, the besieged Bastille will on July 14th be pulled down by you from top to bottom."
The role played by the Masons, or to be more precise, the Neo-Templars, in realizing the revolution was revealed in 1789 when the Inquisition arrested Cagliostro. He quickly confessed and told all he knew, hoping to save his life. One of the first things he told the Inquisition was that the Masons were planning revolutions right across Europe, intending to finish off what the Templars had begun, namely, to either destroy the papacy or bring it under their control. According to William Still,
in 1790, only 5 years after the Bavarian suppression, the magician Cagliostro revealed at his own interrogatory before the Holy See in Rome that the Illuminati was not dead, but actively working to ignite a revolution in France. Cagliostro recounted that at the time of his entry into the Illuminati in 1783, his initiators followed rituals read from an ancient manuscript, which stated that Illuminism was a conspiracy directed against thrones and altars, and that the first blows were to be struck against the French monarchy, followed by a direct attack on the heart of Christianity of that day, the Catholic Church. Cagliostro explained how the Germans had secretly been infiltrating the French Masonic lodges for years in hopes of eventually bringing them under the control of the Illuminati.
in his 1790 testimony at Rome, he said that this knowledge was revealed to him in 1780 at a strict observant lodge operated by members of the Illuminati. Unlike the other philosophers, who were in favor of monarchy, at least a constitutional monarchy, Rousseau advocated direct democracy. Rousseau's theology and educational methods are tightly bound together. He argues against the biblical view that humanity is fallen and needs a redeemer. He believes that our reason and intellect are fully capable of discerning what is right and wrong, without the need of special revelation or the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. As a result, Rousseau argues that a proper education is man's only hope for knowing what limited truth is available. In fact, the central concept in Rousseau's thought is liberty, and most of his works deal with the ways in which people are forced to give up that liberty. His famous statement, "All men are born free, but everywhere they are in chains," begins his work, The Social Contract, published in 1762. This work sets out many of his key ideas that were to greatly influence modern culture. Here we read about his thoughts on the noble savage and how he uses this concept to visualize how man developed over the eons and how, in his view, this development went off the rails. He refers to times before the current state of civil society, when man was closer to his natural state, as happier times for man. To Rousseau, modern civil society is a trick perpetrated by the powerful on the weak in order to maintain their power or wealth.
Rousseau's state is not merely authoritarian, it is also totalitarian, since it orders every aspect of human activity, thought included. Under the social contract, the individual was obliged to alienate himself with all his rights to the whole of the community. In a number of ways, the state Rousseau planned for Corsica anticipated the one the Pol Pot regime actually tried to create in Cambodia. And this is not entirely surprising, since the Paris-educated leaders of the regime had all absorbed Rousseau's ideas. He did not use the word brainwash, but he wrote, "Those who control a people's opinions control its actions. Such control is established by treating citizens from infancy as children of the state, trained to consider themselves only in their relationship to the body of the state." Again, this anticipates Mussolini's central fascist doctrine: everything within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Hence, and this is the true revolution Rousseau's ideas brought about, he moved the political process to the very center of human existence by making the legislator, who is also a pedagogue, into the new Messiah, capable of solving all human problems by creating new men.
The Enlightenment thinkers believe with Rousseau that man is in principle good and only need the right education administered without coercion in the utmost possible individual liberty to make and live in a perfect society. Progress, they believe, is inevitable. This is a contentless ethics, telling us neither what to do correctly nor how to deal with offenders against the public welfare. An ethics so lacking in content and discipline that it cannot in principle declare any human thought or action absolutely evil, or good for that matter, is useless. Its practical result is utilitarian situation ethics, advocated ironically and blasphemously in the name of love.
The evil of competition, as he saw it, which destroys man's inborn communal sense and encourages all his most evil traits, including his desire to exploit others, led Rousseau to distrust private property as the source of social crime. His fifth innovation, then, on the very eve of the Industrial Revolution, was to develop the elements of a critique of capitalism, both in the preface to his Place, Narcisse, and in his Discours sur l'inégalité, by identifying property and the competition to acquire it as the primary cause of alienation. This was a thought deposit Marx and others were to mine ruthlessly, together with Rousseau's related idea of cultural evolution. To him, natural meant original or pre-cultural. All culture brings problems, since it is man's association with others which brings out his evil propensities. As he puts it in Emile, man's breath is fatal to his fellow men. Thus, the culture in which man lived, itself an evolving artificial construct, dictated man's behavior, and you could improve, indeed totally transform his behavior by changing the culture and the competitive forces which produced it, that is, by social engineering.
Rousseau thought Voltaire's rationalism was too cold, and that the basis of man's actions should be his emotions and feelings. This is the philosophy of French Romanticism. Rousseau thought that the root of man's problems is society, and that if man was left in his uncivilized state, he would be morally superior. His ideas became the thinking behind today's ideas of permissive child rearing. After all, it's not the child's fault. Social planning. Government must provide everything for the child. And environmentalism. Individual control of property leads to social evils.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau was the inspirer, the messiah of the Romantic movement. A child of the Enlightenment, Rousseau became the father of the Romantic movement. His gospel exalted feeling above thought. the assumption of the philosophies that faith and feeling must submit to reason, provoked a Romanticist reaction which looked upon life and its interpretation as based more on feeling than on thought. Romanticism is the establishment of human life on a pure basis of feeling. Skepticism, rationalism, and intellectualism of the Age of Reason came to be challenged everywhere by faith and feeling, imagination and mystery, sentiment and romance. In the New Age of Feeling, sensibility and emotional expression became an ideal and a fashion.
Rousseau died on the 2nd of July 1798 at Ermenonville, north of Paris. During the French Revolution, his body was moved to the Pantheon in Paris, while a statue of him can be found in the Isle Rousseau in Geneva. In 1794, 5 years after the storming of the Bastille and the start of the French Revolution, an epical event that many felt Rousseau had inspired, the philosopher's body was exhumed and transferred to Paris in a public procession that lasted 3 days. Few people in history have caused such a wide spectrum of responses to their ideas. At his death, Rousseau's burial site became a place of pilgrimage. George Sand referred to him as Saint Rousseau. Shelley called him a sublime genius, and Scheller, a Christ-like soul for whom only heaven's angels are fit company. However, others had a different perspective.
He's best summed up by the woman who, he said, was his only love, Sophie Dutot. She lived until 1813 and, in extreme old age, delivered this verdict. He was ugly enough to frighten me, and love did not make him more attractive. But he was a pathetic figure, and I treated him with gentleness and kindness. He was an interesting madman.
Voltaire is the pen name for the man who began his life as François-Marie Arouet and who became one of the most famous and infamous philosophers of the Enlightenment. Voltaire was a celebrity and a controversial figure in his lifetime. He adopted the name Voltaire after his imprisonment in the Bastille for writing satiric verse. Jailed again briefly in the Bastille in 1726, he was exiled to England for 3 years, then lived in France and Germany and returned to Paris in 1772. He tried to disprove the Bible. He said that in another century from his time, nobody will even want to read the Bible anymore, and the only place that one would be able to see a Bible would be in a museum. His philosophy of rationalism stated that man's reason is the sole criterion for truth. He said reason is God and there are no absolutes. He even advocated revolution to overthrow traditional institutions of home, church and government so that a new order could be set up based on reason and science. There's undeniable evidence that Voltaire, the arch enemy of Christianity, was a Mason. Not only so, the first day he joined the lodge, they immediately inducted him into the highest degrees of Freemasonry. Why this was done? Because Voltaire's life exemplified Masonic ideals before he was a member.
On April 7, 1778, Voltaire was taken to the Nine Sisters Lodge of the Freemasons. He was initiated into membership without being required to pass through the usual preliminary stages. A laurel wreath was put upon his head, and the chairman made a speech. "We swear to help our brothers, but you have been the founder of an entire colony which adores you and which overflows with your benefactions. You, much beloved brother, have been a Freemason before you received the degree, and you have fulfilled the obligations of a Freemason before you promised to keep them."
Voltaire was impressed with England's greater freedoms and felt France could do as well. A crucial difference: England had Reformation base, France had Voltaire's secular humanism. The few French who were religious were deists.
The most profound and lasting influence of Voltaire has been on religious belief. Through him and his associates, France bypassed the Reformation and went directly from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Perhaps that is one reason why the change was so violent. There was no pause at Protestantism. Some enthusiasts felt that the Enlightenment as a whole was a deeper reformation than that which Luther and Calvin had effected, for it challenged not merely the excesses of sacerdotalism and superstition, but the very fundamentals of Christianity, even of all supernatural creeds. Voltaire gathered into one voice all the varieties of anti-Catholic thought. It gave them added force by clarity, repetition, and wit, and for a time, it seemed as if he had pulled down the temple in which he had been reared. The intellectual classes throughout Christendom were moved by the philosophes to a polite deism, or a sacred atheism. Between 1817 and 1829, there were 12 editions of Voltaire's collected works. In those years, over 3 million volumes by Voltaire were sold. The communist crusade under Marx and Engels once more gave the leadership to Rousseau. In general, the revolutionary movement since 1848 has followed Rousseau rather than Voltaire in politics, Voltaire rather than Rousseau in religion.
It was the Duke of Orleans, Grand Master of the Grand Orient Lodge of Freemasons, who was financed by the Jacobins to stimulate the people into rebellion. In this stealthy move, his hope was to enthrone himself King of France.
Bands of strangers, men of wild, haggard, and ferocious appearance, whose persons the still watchful police of Paris were unacquainted with, began to be seen in the metropolis, like those obscene and ill-omened birds which are seldom visible except before a storm. All these were understood to be suborned by the Duke of Orleans and his agents to unite with the ignorant, violent, corrupted populace of the great metropolis of France for the purpose of urging and guiding them to actions of terror and cruelty. The ultimate object of these maneuvers is supposed to have been a change of dynasty, which should gratify the Duke of Orleans' revenge by the deposition of his cousin and his ambition by enthroning himself in his stead, or at least by nominating him Lieutenant of France with all the royal power.
This propaganda campaign included financing anyone who can spew the worst vitriolic diatribes in their book, pamphlets, and newspaper against the king.
This foul and desperate faction could not, by all the activity it used, have attained the sway which it exerted among the lees of the people without possessing and exercising extensively power of suborning inferior leaders among the populace. It has been generally asserted that means for attaining this important object were supplied by the immense wealth of the nearest prince of the blood royal, that Duke of Orleans, whose name is so unhappily mixed with the history of this period. By his largesses, according to the general report of historians, a number of the most violent writers of pamphlets and newspapers were pensioned, who deluged the public with false news and violent abuse. This prince, it is said, recompensed those popular and ferocious orators who nightly harangued the people in the palace royal and openly stimulated them to the most violent aggressions upon the persons and property of obnoxious individuals. From the same unhappy man's coffers were paid numbers of those who regularly attended on the debates of the assembly, crowded the galleries to the exclusion of the public at large, applauded, hissed, exercised an almost domineering influence in the national councils, and were sometimes addressed by the representatives of the people as if they had themselves been the people of whom they were the scum and the refuse.
The Illuminati created situations in order to create dissension among the people. For instance, the Duke of Orleans instructed his agents to buy up as much grain as they could. Then the people were led to believe that King Louis XVI intentionally caused the shortage and that the French people were starving.
The intrigue that directed the opening stages of the revolution was, however, the Orleanist conspiracy, and it was by this faction that the artificial scarcity of grain was created during the spring and summer of 1789, and that the siege of the Bastille on July 14th and the march on Versailles on October 5th were organized. But since the Duc d'Orléans, while lending himself to the plan of usurping the throne of France, was at the same time Grand Master of the Grand Orient, and all the revolutionary leaders, Orleanist or otherwise, were members of the lodges, it is obviously impossible to disentangle the threads of the two intrigues. The plan of Weishaupt was always to make use of princes to further their own ends, and it would be interesting to discover whether the loans raised by the Duc d'Orléans in Amsterdam and England, wherewith, as the revolution proceeded, he replenished his coffers, came from the funds of the Illuminati in those places.
The success of using food as a weapon to control, punish, eliminate a people was again used by the Soviet communists. This resulted in the death of between 7 to 10 million people, mainly Ukrainians. This was instigated by Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and his henchman Lazar Gaganovich. The main goal of this artificial famine genocide was to break the spirit of the Ukrainian farmer-peasant and to force them into collectivization. Byron Dalit is a survivor of this atrocity who told it all in his thought-provoking book, Execution by Hunger: The Hidden Holocaust.
The policy of compulsory collectivation, introduced at the end of 1929, called for all farms to be collectivized and the farmers to be firmly bound to the collective, just as they used to be bound as serfs to the feudal estate some 70 years before. The farms were collectivized, but not without struggle. The farmers fiercely resisted the collectivization efforts. They clung to their plots of land, their possessions for dear life, and the struggle became one for life or death. But unarmed, disorganized, and leaderless, the farmers were no match for government forces. They were crushed mercilessly. Their villages were ruined and depopulated. Millions died. Many were sent to concentration camps or banished from their villages to godforsaken northern regions. And still others simply disappeared mysteriously without a trace. Those who survived swallowed their pride and finally joined the collective farms in order to save themselves and their families. Thus the battle came to an end. The farmers lost and the communists triumphed. Only within a few years, 4 in all, the traditional patterns of village life were destroyed.
Since then, this has become a standard tool in the arsenal of communist regimes to control, punish, eliminate people, and has been used by such regimes such as China, North Korea, Ethiopia, Cambodia, among others. In the early 17th century, Henry IV of France issued the Edict of Nantes in 1598. The edict guaranteed religious freedom to the Calvinist Protestants of France, also known as Huguenots. Many Huguenots were successful in business and crafts. Papal Rome rejected the apparent recognition of Protestantism as a permanent element in French society and still hoped to enforce religious uniformity. Louis XIV, a devout Catholic, became king at the age of 4 in 1643 upon the death of his father Louis XIII. Louis' mother Anne of Austria ruled on the son's behalf until he was of age. Louis XIV financially destroyed France. He was constantly at war with another country, which not only hurt France financially, because wars were very expensive during that time, but it also depleted France's once massive army. During a time of famine, crop failure, and bitter cold, Louis raised the taxes immensely to stave off bankruptcy, but brought about greater misery on the common people of France. He revoked the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which had given religious tolerance to the Huguenots. Huguenots were forced to convert to Catholicism or go to jail. Ultimately, over 200,000 Huguenots fled the country, which represented a severe economic setback for France. Many immigrated to England, Netherlands, Prussia, and Russia. Since many Huguenots belonged to the merchant and artisan classes, they took their knowledge and skills with them. This decision may have been Louis' biggest error, in that it weakened France's economic position. Kenneth Latourette captures this dismal moment in French history.
Then, in the reign of Louis XIV, the Grand Monarch who followed Louis XIII, progressively severe restrictions were imposed. They culminated in the destruction of churches, the compulsory removal of Protestant children from their parents to be reared as Catholics, and in 1685, the formal revocation of the Edict of Nantes. Louis was moved to these steps by his heightened devotion to the Catholic faith, which came in middle age under the influence of his wife, Madame de Maintenon, and by his settled purpose to be supreme in his realm. This latter desire had been hampered by what remained of the privileged position of the Huguenot community. To escape with the persecutions which preceded, accompanied, and followed the abrogation of the edict, tens of thousands of Huguenots left the country and found refuge in other lands. In Prussia, Holland, England, Ireland, the English colonies in America, and even in remote South Africa. Some who remained conformed to the Catholic Church. Protestantism in France declined in numbers, but did not disappear. It persisted and was to have a notable record in the 19th and 20th centuries.
In July 1788, a hailstorm destroyed crops. France had its worst harvest in 40 years, and the winter of 1788 and 89 was severe. Getting no relief from their hunger, people rioted. The economy declined further. In Paris, construction workers were joining the ranks of the unemployed. People were being evicted from their rented homes. People had been in the habit of eating mainly bread, and it now took most of the wages of those still working to obtain it. According to the still current propaganda, Louis XVI was a merciless and stupid tyrant. In actual fact, he was a kind, well-meaning person, a warmly religious family man, and besides, extremely clever and well-read.
The reforms undertaken by Louis XVI immediately after his coronation gave the French yet another substantial reason to look more optimistically at life. The king attempted everything in an effort to relieve the suffering of the masses. He allowed wheat to be sold tax-free. By 1779, he abolished all slavery within the country. A year later, made torture illegal, and finally allowed the practice of non-Catholic and non-Christian religions. In 1787, he proposed a change to the hiring laws, which included prohibition of discrimination due to social rank. On several different occasions, he cut the expenses of the royal family and royal court. In 1788, he made sweeping reforms in prisons and hospitals.
Walter Scott also acknowledges King Louis XVI's fidelity to the French people when he said,
Louis XVI, fully sensible of the disastrous state of the public revenue, did all he could to contrive a remedy. He limited his personal expenses and those of his household with a rigor which approached parsimony and dimmed the necessary splendor of the throne. He abolished many pensions, and by doing so not only disobliged those who were deprived of the instant enjoyment of those gratuities, but lost the attachment of the much more numerous class of expectants who served the court in hope of obtaining similar gratifications in their turn. Lastly, he dismissed a very large proportion of his household troops and bodyguards. Thus, it was the misfortune of this well-meaning prince only to weaken his own cause and endanger his safety by those sacrifices intended to relieve the burdens of the people and supply the wants of the state. Many obnoxious and oppressive laws have been expressly abrogated or tacitly suffered to become obsolete, and there never sat a king upon the French or any other throne more willing than Louis XVI to sacrifice his own personal interest and prerogative to whatever seemed to be the benefit of the state. Even at the very commencement of his reign, when obeying only the dictates of his own beneficence, he reformed the penal code of France, which then savored of the barbarous times in which it had originated. He abolished the use of torture. He restored to freedom those prisoners of state, the mournful inhabitants of the Bastille and other fortresses who had been victims of his grandfather's jealousy. The compulsory labor called the corvée, levied from the peasantry, and one principal source of popular discontent, had been abolished in some provinces and modified in others.
Louis XVI paved the way for the fall of the monarchy through constant small concessions to the Freemasons and the Illuminati. During his reign, he made some very poor decisions that could have influenced the end result of the French Revolution. In the summer of 1788, France was having an economic crisis. Louis XVI yielded to the pressure and assembled the Estates General, which was a governmental body that represented France's three estates: the government, the nobles, the church, and the French common people. Jacques Necker was a French statesman of Swiss birth and finance minister of Louis XVI. Necker made a lot of the king's decisions and persuaded him. Necker was soon fired for his financial indiscretions.
We can easily imagine what policy that allegiance inspired in Necker, and when we add this to the fact that his previous record was that of a daring and unscrupulous speculator, we can understand why the national finances of France under his baneful aegis rapidly worsened, so that after 4 years of his manipulations, the unfortunate king's government had contracted an additional and far more serious debt of £170 million.
Webster lists the possible motives for Necker's treasonous economic maneuvers, which contributed to the revolution.
Most culpable of all was Necker, whom both the king and queen had trusted to steer the ship of state to safety. From the beginning, his only consideration had been popularity, his only policy to temporize. His method of dealing with a financial crisis had consisted in raising perpetual loans. The attitude of Necker admits only of two explanations. Either he was in league with the Orleanists, or he was afraid of them. In either case, his conduct was contemptible, as contemporaries of all parties agree. It was the king's discovery of his incapacity, which all the world now acknowledges, that has been accepted as an adequate pretext for the Revolution of July.
The first French constitution was completed in 1791 and signed by the unhappy King Louis XVI. It is important to note that while the second constitution was drawn up in 1793, before the onset of the terror of Robespierre, it was never enacted. France's Declaration of Rights of Man and its constitution in 1791 provided a legal context for the horrific September massacres, of which clergymen were the most prominent victims, as well as the apocalyptic slaughter unleashed on France by Robespierre. Around 10 a.m. on August 10, 1792, a mob of nearly 30,000 French citizens advanced towards the Tuileries Palace to capture King Louis XVI. Louis had been given information that told him an angry mob was headed for the palace, so he decided to move himself and his family to the Legislative Assembly building. The mob searched the palace with vengeance in their hearts, leaving only 300 of the 900 Swiss guards alive. The people found no king inside the palace, but murdered anyone within the walls that might have been associated with the king. Cooks, servants, maids, etc. No one was spared. Similar to the leftists of today, the revolutionaries of France, like the Illuminati, despised Christianity. They did not support Christian morals. Torture, vampirism, even the atrocity of cannibalism was commonplace with the revolutionaries. They wanted to destroy any existing morality so that they could carry on with the reconstruction of society.
A mad rage for destruction possessed them. Everything animate or inanimate fell beneath the blows of their pikes and muskets. A murderer played the violin beside the corpses, and thieves with their pockets full of gold hanged other thieves on the banisters. Still worse horrors took place that cannot be written. Nameless indecencies, hideous debaucheries, ghastly mutilations of the dead, and again, as after the siege of the Bastille, cannibal orgies. For the cannibals of the Tuileries, the horrible women of the Paris faubourgs, plunging their knives into the bodies of their victims, had not evolved such deeds from their own inner consciousness. For months, they had been trained by the Jacobins, where murder and violence were systematically preached, and every means employed to excite their passion.
Scott also recorded another shocking case of Jacobin-trained cannibals, killing and eating the heart and drinking the blood of corpses.
The second remarkable particular was that from being one of the most light-hearted and kind-tempered of nations, the French seemed upon the Revolution to have been animated not merely with the courage, but with the rabid fury of unchained wild beasts. Foulon and Berthier, two individuals whom they considered as enemies of the people, were put to death, and in emulation of literal cannibals, there were men, or rather monsters, found not only to tear asunder the limbs of their victims, but to eat their hearts and drink their blood. The intensity of the new doctrines of freedom, animosities, even in the lowest and most ignorant of the populace. Those who led the way in such unheard-of enormities must have been practiced murderers and assassins mixed with the insurgents, like old hounds in a young pack, to lead them on, flesh them with slaughter, and teach an example of cruelty too easily learned, but hard to ever be forgotten.
Satan had full control over the masses to perform his diabolical will. They lost all restraint because they traded the Bible for deism, atheism, and idolatry. Before the revolution, the people of France had not known such savagery. We saw that Darwin's doctrine of evolution favors cannibalism for some classes of people. The Illuminist philosophers provided the ideology that shaped the Jacobins, who in turn inspired the mob to commit egregious suffering and death to protesters. On September the 21st, 1792, a decree was passed that the royalty is abolished in France, and a republic was proclaimed. 4 months later, Louis XVI was sent to the guillotine. Mary Antoinette followed him to the guillotine on 16th of October, 1793.
The idea of a private execution, where the condemned person cannot have a final word to those who have condemned him, is anything but liberal-minded. It was long considered a basic legal privilege in the West for a condemned person to have this final opportunity to speak his mind. The sign of the intolerance of the liberal French revolutionaries was their unwillingness to allow King Louis XVI to speak to the crowd at his execution. The judges had ordered drummers to begin drumming the moment he began to speak.
Rebellion vanquished the Spirit of God from Cain, leaving him with a fallen continent revved with murderous overtones. Similarly, the gathering mob haunting expression on their faces betrayed the fact that demons had overtaken France.
Bouzeau has thus described the aspect of the deputations and audiences collected by Marat and Robespierre at the convention. It seemed as if they had sought in all the slums of Paris and of the large cities for everything that was the filthiest, most hideous, and polluted. Dreadful earthen faces, black or copper-colored, surmounted by a thick tuft of greasy hair, with eyes half sunken in their heads. They gave vent with their fetid breath to the coarsest insults and shrill screams of hungry animals. Their tribunes were worthy of such legislators, men whose frightful appearance gave evidence of crime and wretchedness, women whose shameless air expressed the foulest debauchery. When all these, with hands, feet, and voices, made their horrible din, one would have imagined oneself in an assembly of devils.
People of Paris, it's time to open your eyes! Shake yourselves out of your torpor! Wake up! Once more, wake up!
Jean-Paul Marat, notorious for his inspiring yet aggressive publications during the French Revolution, was one of the most influential characters of the late 18th century. His radical publications helped induce the violent manner of the revolution. Marat's radical views and the ferocity with which he voiced them won his great popularity among the lower classes in Paris and the provinces. And in 1791, after Paris was declared under martial law, after the Champs de Mars massacre, he went into the sewers, hiding from Lafayette and the National Guard. There he contracted a devastating skin disease. It was a terrible disorder which caused itching, rashes, and a terrible stench, and immense pain. He took to wearing turbans around his head and doing much of his own work in a mineral bath. When the moderate experiment with limited monarchy failed in the midst of disastrous military reverses, the king was disposed in August 1792, and less than a month later the September massacres, an outbreak of popular executions such as Marat had been urging, took place in Paris. These events inaugurated the radical phase of the French Revolution.
This insatiable sect calls out by the mouth of the bloody Marat for 270,000 heads, declaring that before long it will count only by millions. They know well that their systems and last mysteries of equality can only be accomplished in its full extent by depopulating the world. And by the mouth of Lebeau, it answers the inhabitants of Montauban, terrified of want of provisions. Fear not! France has a sufficiency for 12 million inhabitants. All the rest, that is the other 12 million, must be put to death, and then there will be no scarcity of bread.
The emissaries of the Commune paid and brainwashed 300 assassins to annihilate the prisoners in the September massacres. They were mentally prepared with mind-altering drugs to perform the task of murdering the prisoners. According to Webster, the chaos and the drug inducements is a well-documented fact.
Apart from the evidence of eyewitnesses who saw the assassins being paid by the emissaries of the Commune, we have documentary proof of these facts. The registers of the Commune recording the sums paid were preserved. A number of receipts signed by the murderers were still in existence until 1871. As to the ferocity they displayed once they had set themselves to the task, it is to be explained in the same way as the outrages committed at the Tuileries on the 10th of August, by the effect of fiery liquor working on overwrought brains. Moreover, this time, it was not merely alcohol that had been given to them, but something more insidious that had been purposely introduced into the drink with which they were plied incessantly. This circumstance explains the fact that at moments the assassins showed themselves capable of humanity. Evidently, when the first effects of the drug had begun to wear off, they returned more or less to a normal frame of mind.
The September massacres consisted of several attacks on the prison in Paris. The massacres began on September the 2nd, 1792, and lasted 5 days. The first attack occurred when 24 priests being transported to the prison named L'Abbaye were attacked by a mob of angry citizens of Paris. They quickly and grotesquely killed all of the priests as they were trying to escape into the prison, and moved on to kill other prisoners as well.
Between the insurrection of August 10th and the seating of the National Convention on September 21st, the infamous September massacres took place. This was a wholesale murdering of those prisoners arrested on suspicion of treason since August 10th. Non-juring priests, royalist sympathizers, and noblemen. An estimated 1,300 prisoners were slaughtered in 5 days, another round of blood fury.
The rationale for developing the massacre of early September was simply a pretext invented by the Jacobins, eager to kill those who disagreed with them. Mahar's triumph led ironically to his own death. Charlotte Corday, an idealistic young girl of Jourdan sympathies from the provinces, came to Paris to seek revenge and to rid her country of the monster Mahar. On July 13, 1793, she managed to gain attendance to his apartment under the pretense of bringing information to aid him in his continued campaign against the Jourdans and stabbed him to death in his bath.
A body of people associated for a common purpose or interest, such as a guild, a group joined by similar backgrounds, occupations, interests, or tastes, the quality or condition of being brothers, brotherliness. Behold, how good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity.
We now come to examine the last of the three doctrines of the Democratic Creed, fraternity, that upon some terms and to some extent it is desirable that men should wish well to and should help each other is common ground to everyone. However, it's futile to expect to have fraternity if liberty and equality are not mentally established.
The Jacobins can be compared to none that ever existed, for none but themselves ever thought of an organized, regular, and continued system of murdering and plundering the rich, that they might debauch the poor by the distribution of their spoils. The Jacobins imprisoned 300,000 of their countrymen in the name of liberty, and put to death more than half the number under the sanction of fraternity.
Society could only enjoy fraternity when wrongs are exposed and corrected. This means separating ourselves from evil and actively opposing it.
All that is required for evil to flourish in the world is for good men to do nothing. Blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of the ungodly, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of the scornful. And what concord hath Christ with Belial? Or what part hath he that believeth with an infidel? Wherefore come out from among them, and be ye separate, saith the Lord, and I will receive you.
The creed of liberty, equality, and fraternity is intelligible only in relation to the idea of a creator, a divine father who established fraternity among men. The most distinctive New Testament usage of the term brother is that which expresses a spiritual relationship. It is a common designation for a Christian community in which God is Father and all believers are brothers. This relationship is not merely figurative, but is based on a spiritual birth, which makes its recipients fellow possessors of a new life.
Therefore, if any man be in Christ, that he is a new creature, old things are passed away. Behold, all things are become new.
The Christian community is called a brotherhood, and as such is to be marked by love and keeping God's commandments.
Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Whosoever believeth that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone that loveth him that begat loveth him also that is begotten of him. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not grievous.
Christians are in the middle of a war that has opened up a new front for us today. We have long recognized Satan as our arch enemy and accept the warning that he is a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. Today he has a new tactic based upon the old principle of peer pressure and our need to be like those around us. This is an unbiblical fraternity which leads to a new world order. Some term the war we are in cultural war.
Fraternity does not exclude disagreements, only perfect knowledge can do that, and fraternity rejects such a claim. Indeed, the suppression of disagreement only produces self-contempt in the suppressing individual, and unconditional cooperation results in contempt for him whose eagerness to cooperate suggests that he has nothing of value to offer. To hide disagreement is to draw lines of superiority and inferiority between the self and the other. If the disagreement is related to shared values, suppression of it implies that the relationship itself is of more importance than the values which are at its normal basis, and this, as such, is a denial of fraternity.
Time will come according to prophecy. Dissenters will be put to death for not fraternizing with the unjust demands of the New World Order.
In the extreme case, the aim will be the elimination of the separate personality of the other, the achievement of total subjection. In a painful paradox, that control is possible only by the death of the other. Fratricide is the hidden theme of those who would make fraternity an ultimate value. It is possible to love everyone equally, only if one loves nothing in particular.
Biblical fraternity involves overcoming sin, parting company with the ungodly, and speaking out against evil. A false fraternity leads to a rejection of these scriptural values. The poisonous fruits can be seen in the French Revolution and today.
American academic philosophy is becoming multicultural according to the diversity model.
Multiculturalism is built upon the concept that all cultures are equivalent. The suggestion that one culture is superior to another in any respect is unacceptable. The radicalism of equivalence demands an unnatural self-censorship, which is enforced by the anti-intellectual tyranny of political correctness. The logic of multiculturalism asserts that since all cultures are equivalent, then any criticism of any culture by someone of another cannot be founded in fact and can only be motivated by hatred or bigotry. What multiculturalists seek is not the goal that they advertise, but something else entirely. Multiculturalism is not the road to education and acceptance, but an agent of anti-Western ideology.
God has given us moral and doctrinal absolutes that judge all cultures, including our own. Some aspects of culture, clothing, styles, food, art forms, and so on are mere matters of taste or preference. We can and should be flexible in these areas of legitimate cultural diversity, being willing even to change from our own to another pattern for the sake of better communication, according to 1 Corinthians 9:19-23. But biblical Christians believe in the existence of universal right and wrong, a measure based on the character of God and standing above all cultures. Because postmodern education has rejected the possibility of absolutes, it has no basis for moral critique or limits on diversity. The well-known controversy over accepting the gay and lesbian communities as normal manifestations of diversity is a case in point. Without authoritative moral norms based on the Bible and natural law, anything is possible.
Under the influence of multiculturalism, increasingly the upper intellectual ranks of Americans have come to the opinion that there is nothing they believe to be true, and they persist in teaching that to their students. The most sinister aspect of multiculturalism politically is that it teaches American students and citizens to discard their loyalty to the United States in the name of pantheistic diversity and to abandon anything that smacks of patriotism. Berajus cautions her readers about the anti-Christian pantheistic bias of multiculturalism.
Did you know that multiculturalism ruled out loyalty to our country? I didn't. Like most parents, I believe that multicultural education simply helps students understand other cultures and people. In reality, it trains students to view the world and its people from a global and pantheistic perspective, rather than from a national and Judeo-Christian perspective. In other words, it is designed to speed the paradigm shift, the current transformation toward a radical new way of thinking, believing, and relating to our global family. Children must either reject their old home-taught faith or stretch it far beyond biblical boundaries to include the world's pantheistic, polytheistic belief systems.
America's education system is now used to dismantle their culture, not to uphold it, and has moved from the age of reason to the age of deconstruction. The Christian foundation has been eroded and shaped into values that destroy previous pantheistic civilizations, Professor Alvin Smith contends.
Statistics reveal that 81% of Americans identify with Christianity. Nonetheless, multiculturalists continue to remove biblical norms from the public school curricula and to expunge Christian symbols from tax-supported public buildings. Similar efforts are not directed against non-Christian or neo-pagan religious groups. Indeed, in some instances, special efforts are made to implement and support non-Christian practices or symbols. The bias in favor of pagan religious values in opposition to Christian values and symbols is also evident in some recent movies. For instance, The Lion King and Pocahontas. Both films favorably dispense neo-pagan beliefs. Pocahontas, widely touted as a multicultural film, pays high tribute to the pantheistic beliefs of the Powhatan tribe. It has Grandmother Willow, a talking tree, tell Pocahontas that sacred spirits reside in plants, rocks, wind, earth, and so on. All around you are spirits, child. If you listen, they will guide you, says Grandmother Willow. Thus, the pantheistic beliefs of American Indians are supported by multiculturalism, while Christianity is discriminated against in numerous movies. Americans can be fooled by these seemingly harmless movies only at their own peril. Films like these are subtle attacks on Judeo-Christian values. It is part of the multiculturalist design to undermine and destroy the Judeo-Christian components of the Euro-American culture, and thus another way of endangering America's soul.
Later, after naming Noah's 3 sons, Genesis tells how from them came the people who were scattered over the earth. This reference to scattering hints at the dual nature of cultural diversity in Scripture. On the one hand, cultural diversity is a proper expression of the cultural mandate. By scattering and filling the earth, humanity subdues it piece by piece and place by place. On the other hand, it is an expression of the curse enacted at Babel in response to humanity's non-cultural attempt to live in defiance of God.
The people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. Let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth.
In his recent book, Patrick Buchanan, a political analyst, draws from the Babel experience to refute the argument of the leftist that diversity would make America stronger.
Did God of the Pentateuch strengthen the people he had created when he destroyed the unity of their language and scattered them to the 4 corners of the earth? To hear men endlessly recite this mindless mantra, our diversity is our strength, when tribal, ethnic, and religious diversity is tearing nations to pieces, is to recall Orwell. Only an intellectual could make a statement like that. No ordinary man could be such a fool.
For a society to succeed, its citizens must be able to unite around common core values. The most fundamental values are the Constitution and a wish for fellowship with one's countrymen. People who are deeply divided on core values and who want the community to evolve in completely different directions simply feel less fellowship with one another. Buchanan drives this message home with a few hard-hitting examples of immigrants who believe that their loyalty to their country comes first.
Major Hassan's massacre should rivet our attention on the issue of dual loyalties in the hearts of men in a country wedded to the idea that the greater our religious, racial, and ethnic diversity, the more moral a people we will become. What Hassan saw as a higher loyalty to Islam moved him to murder fellow soldiers. What Alger Hiss saw as a higher loyalty to his political faith, communism, moved him to transfer America's secrets to Soviet agents in Stalin's time. What Jonathan Pollard saw as his sacred identity as a Jew moved him to betray his oath, loot America's vital secrets, and transfer them to an Israeli agent. The 1993 Long Island Railroad Massacre, where 6 died and 19 were wounded, was the work of Jamaican Colin Ferguson, who hated whites. The Virginia Tech slaughter, where 32 died and 25 were wounded, was carried out by a Korean student. The massacre at the Binghamton Immigration Center in 2009, where 13 people were shot to death, was the work of Jairali Wong, a Chinese man from Vietnam. Asked by fellow workers if he liked the New York Yankees, Wong replied, "No, I don't like that team. I don't like America. America sucks." No longer are we one nation and one people. Tens of millions have arrived, and more are coming, whose loyalties remain to the countries they left behind and the faiths they carry in their hearts.
The logical result of multiculturalism is to create a world of primitive tribalistic mentalities that form countries, sub-tribes based on unchosen identities and battle each other for power and unearned wealth until all values and lives are destroyed, which is the ultimate goal of nihilistic pantheism. Jesus challenges all cultures to accept the transforming power of his redemptive love. Christ challenges traditionally Christian cultures to repent of their sins and to make restitution to peoples they have wronged. In his work as Redeemer, Christ offers hope to people of all cultures. He promises an eternal future for people of all tribes, nations, and languages. But the hope is not exclusively future. Christ offers people of all cultures spiritual power now for personal and community transformation. The claim of Christ's universal authority over all cultures is undoubtedly the most troubling and politically incorrect aspect of the Christian faith, but it is non-negotiable. The resurrection makes Jesus Christ a unique figure among all the religious teachers, prophets, sages, and leaders of world history. It shows that he has the power of life and death, and is the proof of his claims to uniquely reveal God. Jesus was in crucial respects a religious and cultural revolutionary. He taught that although God had revealed himself uniquely to the Jews, Jewishness alone was no guarantee of favor with God. He taught that the temple would be destroyed and that the worship of God will be centered in the mind, not in Jerusalem. He taught that a kind of Samaritan or a repentant tax collector was better than a pious but proud or heartless Pharisee. He invited women to be his disciples. He granted healing to Gentiles and ate in the homes of the outcasts. Honoring Christ as ruler of cultures means to accept his rulership over every aspect of one's life, including one's culture and one's relationship to people of other cultures. It means to accept his offer of redemption, forgiveness, spiritual healing, and hope, and to place our hope for redemption in him only. It means to accept his teachings on all subjects on which he speaks in the Bible. If we honor Christ as ruler of cultures, we would do as Christ taught and place our faith in God as creator, provider, father, and king over all cultures. We will love and respect people of all cultures. We will critically examine the beliefs and practices of our own culture to see if they conform to the teachings of Christ.
Not only were many of the founders of the United States government Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose known only to the initiated few.
The American Revolution had a profound impact on the America's Masonic lodges. It should come as no surprise that many American Masons were swept up in the spirit of non-Masonic giants like Thomas Jefferson. The overwhelming majority of the founding fathers were not Freemasons. Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, James Madison, Charles Carroll, John Jay, Samuel Adams, and other prominent founding fathers were not Freemasons. 9 of the 56 signatories on the Declaration of Independence are known to have been Freemasons.
The influence of Freemasonry on the founding fathers of this nation has been the subject of much discussion and concern. It is true that some of the founding fathers were Masons. Benjamin Franklin was a master Mason. George Washington was also a Mason, although he wrote to a friend in 1787 that he had not attended lodge meetings more than once or twice in the preceding 30 years. Part of the reason for concern over Masonry is the fact that in some parts of the world, France in particular, the lodge was a hotbed of radical thinking. This does not appear to have been true in America. Carl Van Doren notes in his biography of Franklin that Freemasonry in America has been social and local with little influence in politics. In France, it was free thinking and opposed to absolutism.
Freemasonry has so successfully overshadowed the founding fathers' Christian faith that few Americans understand and can separate fact from fiction. They acknowledge God's hand guiding them to defend America from a satanic power struggle for control of America.
Many sermons were preached at Masonic meetings that show that Christianity was embraced by early Masonry in America. In fact, the services in early Masonic meetings were only conducted by Christian ministers who preached gospel messages. In addition, many Orthodox Christian clergy were Freemasons, seeing no discrepancy between the two. There were no blood oaths in early Masonry in America, as there are today. The majority of the founders, however, were not Masons, and their influence has been greatly overstated. In fact, less than 20% of the founders were Masons. Modern Masons have tried to exploit the founders to benefit their cause.
While Masons shamelessly promote George Washington's membership and sometimes allege his persevering zeal for the Masonic fraternity, he was a great patriot of America, not because of Freemasonry, but because of his Christian convictions to make America a great nation rather than a self-serving Masonic republic. The French and German lodges were already deeply involved in the occult and were filled with anti-clerics who saw in the Illuminati a way to crush Christianity. The teachings of the Illuminati even reached all the way across the Atlantic and gained a small following in America. In 1798, Reverend Snyder sent a copy of Robinson's book, Proofs of a Conspiracy, which gives a full account of a society of Freemasons that distinguishes itself by the name Illuminati, whose plan is to overturn all government and all religion, to President George Washington. Washington's first response, which is dated September 25, 1798, dismissed the idea that the Illuminati had any influence on American Freemasonry.
I have heard much of the nefarious and dangerous plan and doctrines of the Illuminati, but never saw the book until you were pleased to send it to me. Thanks for your kind wishes and favorable sentiments, except to correct an error you have run into of my presiding over the English lodges in this country. The fact is, I preside over none, nor have I been in one more than once or twice within the last 30 years. I believe, notwithstanding, that none of the lodges in this country are contaminated with the principles ascribed to the Society of the Illuminati.
On October the 24th, Washington wrote a second letter to Snyder and clarified his view that while he believed some of the doctrines of the Illuminati had spread into the United States, he did not believe the Masonic lodges in America had been influenced by these ideas.
I have your favor of the 17th instant before me, and my only motive to trouble you with the receipt of this letter is to explain and correct a mistake which I perceive the hurry in which I am obliged often to write letters have you into. It was not my intention to doubt the doctrines of the Illuminati and the principles of Jacobism had spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more truly satisfied of this fact than I am. The idea that I meant to convey was that I did not believe that the lodges of Freemasons in this country had, as societies, endeavored to propagate the diabolical tenets of the first or pernicious principles of the latter, if they be susceptible of separation. That individuals of them may have done it, or that the founder or instrument employed to be found, the democratic societies in the United States, may have had these objects, and actually had a separation of the people from their government in view, is too evident to be questioned.
Washington, like most early American Masons, viewed the Illuminati as diabolical and nefarious. Although the Illuminati had a few followers in America, their influence was small because, as in England, the members of the American Lodge were not anti-Christian bigots. Masonry started off as military lodges in which both officers and enlisted men could socialize without regard to rank or class. It has changed since the time of the founding fathers. The blood oaths and degrees of rank were added between 1820 to 1845 after many of the founders were dead, and these things also caused a mass exodus of Christians from the lodges, leading to many of the pagan beliefs adopted by Freemasonry today.
It is important also to realize that Freemasonry in the mid and late 1700s was much different than today. The non-Christian aspects of Freemasonry today did not exist in the Freemasonry of Washington's day. The Scottish Rites with its 32 degrees and its secret and non-Christian nature was not created until after Washington's death. The founding fathers who became Masons saw the group as a service organization.
Barton's book on Freemasonry is based on a brief history chronicling the early stages of Masonry in America. Dealing with the anti-Christian pagan development of Masonry, Barton writes about the major philosophical and theological change within the order in the early 19th century.
These oaths had been introduced into Freemasonry shortly before they were exposed by William Morgan in 1825. revelation that contributed to his death. The previous oath that had been part of Masonry since 1724 and preceded the blood oaths was quite different. The perversion that now characterizes the Masonic blood oaths in 1825 did not exist at the time of George Washington and the other founders. American Freemasonry at the time of the founders rejected the current repulsive oaths. Clearly, the evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates that early American Freemasonry was in no way hostile to the teachings of Orthodox Christian ministers in its lodges to preach sermons, conduct Christian services, and cooperate in furthering Christian ministry opportunities.
Barton's writing on Masonry caused a stir among Freemasons, prompting them to respond aggressively to his charges. Writing in defense of Masonic historical revisionism, Michael Mannis set out to counteract Barton and other critics of Freemasonry.
Today, two entire literature venues come against Freemasonry. One, the anti-Mason critics for over 200 years, and two, the David Barton-like Christian establishment revisionisms. The first concoct one Frankenstein after another, and the second rides the same train of obscuring Freemasonry in the founding of the United States of America. Masonry contributed to the founding of the USA like no single church or institution, precisely upon character counting among the founders.
Numerous other publications are replete with similar lies that are deceiving the masses about America's founding.
A faithful witness will not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips. Though God cannot alter the past, historians can. Those who tell the stories rule society.
Intellectual dishonesty wilts under the illuminating light of truth. Revisionist history, an especially cowardly and despicable form of intellectual dishonesty, will be consigned to its proper place, the ash heap of history, when people rediscover the truth.
A false witness shall not be unpunished, and he that speaketh lies shall not escape.
Revisionists wrongfully trumpet the framers of the American Constitution as radical deists. At the time of the American Revolution, deism carried a wide scope of meaning. Deism is not taught by any religion. It is a system of belief held by individuals. Deism is largely a 17th and 18th century phenomenon and was most prominent in England, taking new shape in France and Germany. The Perennial Dictionary of World Religions give a brief but fairly good definition of deism.
The Enlightenment endeavors to purify Christianity, to rid religion of all that was not rational, natural, and moral, and develop a natural religion. An international movement, deism reflected local religious, philosophical, and social expressions of the Enlightenment. In England, it was critically concerned with the origins of religion, but positive in moral and religious affirmation. In France, it was anti-Catholic, shading into skepticism, atheism, and materialism. In Germany, it was championed alongside national metaphysics and historical criticism. In America, it embraced a revolutionary creed. Though indebted to various European cultural developments, deism was particularly an early 18th century English affair. Important literary productions included John Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity and Matthew Tyndall's Christianity as Old as Creation.
We can see deism was not a particular sect, but differ from country to country. Ruud Veldus conceded this important point to remember in Volume 1 of the Encyclopedia of Christianity. He said,
"It has proved almost impossible to define deism in a way that includes all its advocates."
Some deists accept a limited amount of revelation, while others dismiss revealed religion as fiction. According to Alan Wood, a professor of philosophy, no sharp line can be drawn between the both.
Thus, even the principal sense of deism, which refers to belief in God without belief in supernatural revelation, is inherently imprecise. No sharp dividing line can be drawn between Christian or revelationist deist and deists who recognized no revelation. The former often accepted Christian revelation precisely because it accords with natural or rational religion, and sometimes advocated allegorical readings of Scripture in order to secure this agreement, while the latter often disavowed any mean esteem of Christian scriptures and expressed admiration for the inspiring way in which the truths of natural religion were presented in them.
The God of the Enlightenment deism is an absentee landlord who created the universe and left it running. Such a God has no interaction with mankind. He has not revealed himself to us in signs or wonders, nor in the incarnation of Christ. He did not reveal his will on Mount Sinai, nor through prophecies, visions, dreams, and direct communication with inspired men. Still, the Enlightenment deists made an exception. We could detect, they admitted, the signs of a creator in the purpose and order of his creation. The issue centers on how much influence deism had on the founders of America. America's founding fathers are a favorite target of critics who deny the role of Christianity in the country's origins. The impact of deism on Americans in the 1700s is complicated because the word itself represents a spectrum of religious positions held at that time. One extreme represents a group that might be called the non-Christian deists. This faction was openly hostile to the Christian faith. Thomas Paine, of Common Sense fame, and a leading advocate of this position, wrote that deism
is free from all those invented and torturing articles that shock our reason, with which the Christian religion abounds. Its creed is pure and sublimely simple. It believes in God, and there it rests. It honors reason as the choicest gift of God to man, and the faculty by which he is enabled to contemplate the power, wisdom, and goodness of the Creator displayed in the creation. It avoids all presumptuous beliefs and rejects, as the fabulous inventions of man, all books pretending to be revelation.
This quote clearly expressed the complaints and disdain that some deists held against the Christian faith. The founding fathers of the Constitution are often tagged by revisionists as being radical deists. If they succeed, this lie will give credit to 18th century deism as the impetus of America's beginning. The consequences of this hijacking of history would have dire consequences for Christianity today. In what way this perversion of history would undermine Christianity? If rationalistic deism entails a denial of Jesus' divinity, rejection of miracles, and placing man's reason as a determiner of what is accurate in the Bible, then Christianity did not cede America's Constitution. Barton captured the gravity of the revisionist deception when he said,
If revisionists can persuade the public that all of the founders were deists, then they will have recast the founders' religious beliefs, thus concocting a historical precedent for today's unpopular court decisions which limit public religious expressions. The use of overly broad generalizations induces erroneous impressions and wrong conclusions. Therefore, any public policy built on these mistaken foundations will be inherently flawed.
The morality that is common to reason and revelation formed the ground of citizenship in the American founding. It was precisely the rational moral law that made religious liberty possible in America. In other words, while the theological political problem remains unsolvable at the level of ideas, the problem was solved in practice by political men, the American founding fathers. Writing in the early 1830s, Tocqueville noted that
the religious sects which exist in the United States are innumerable. They all differ in respect to the worship which is due from man to his Creator, but they all agree in respect to the duties which are due from man to man. Each sect adores the deity in its own particular manner. All the sects preach the same moral law in the name of God. Moreover, almost all the sects of the United States are comprised within the great unity of Christianity, and Christian morality is everywhere the same.
Christianity in particular and revelation in general were understood not simply as matter of faith, but as a body of objective moral political truth as well, discoverable by reason no less than revelation. Thomas Jefferson was the principal author of the United States Declaration of Independence and the third president of the United States. Jefferson himself regarded Jesus' teachings critically with a mixture of approbation and dissent, just as he would those of any other teacher or philosopher. Jefferson is famous for combing through the Bible and excising anything that hinted of the supernatural was his version of the gospel. In his view, the fabrications and mystifications that grew up around Jesus bolstered the power of the priests over the people, perverting those teachings towards worldly ends. Competition among churches, all claiming to monopolize religious truth, had made Christendom a slaughterhouse. Writing in a letter to John Adams on October 12, 1813, Jefferson indicates that his motive for assembling his version in this manner was because he wanted to offer the pure principles of Jesus' teaching, which constituted
most sublime and benevolent code of morals which has ever been offered to man.
The Jefferson Bible was not meant for publication and broad distribution, but instead modeled for his own, friends, and his family's edification, how a Republican citizen might engage with Scripture. Jefferson was unorthodox, but he was not a secularist, agnostic, or atheist. The moral teachings of Jesus was his prime motivator for his accomplishments.
Jefferson's rejection of Trinitarianism placed him in agreement with the deist and Unitarians of his day. He agreed with the deists, Unitarians, and Christians in believing that God was the creator of all things, including man, and believing that God had established certain physical and moral laws by which the universe and human society were to be governed. However, Jefferson rejected the deist belief that God created the universe, established certain scientific principles and laws by which the universe operates, and now takes no active role in the affairs of mankind. It does not work actively in the universe except possibly through the continuing effort of the laws of nature, which he placed in operation. In contrast, Jefferson believed that God was the sustainer as well as the creator of the universe. Jefferson was convinced that the universe could not operate according to previously established laws on its own. Its continued efficacy required the superintending and guiding power of providence.
Jefferson did not hesitate to invoke a God who acted through history. Unlike the distant and indifferent clockmaker of the Enlightenment deism, Jefferson's faith was not a product of the Enlightenment. He was not a deist relic in a Christian age, as the atheist revisionist Barker wants us to believe.
When Jefferson wrote about the Creator in the Declaration of Independence, he was not talking about the Christian God. As a deist, he viewed the Creator as a much less personal being than the biblical deity. The God of deism was more like nature than Jehovah.
To the contrary, Jefferson's conception of republicanism and nationhood drew him towards Christianity by encouraging him to identify with the overwhelmingly Christian American people, by underscoring the need for common values and beliefs to sustain republicanism, and by countering the cosmopolitan and universalistic tendencies of the Enlightenment. Jefferson fervently believed that Americans constituted a unique and exceptional people with a providential role to play in the progressive transformation of the modern world.
For example, some contemporary works incorrectly assert that Jefferson called himself a deist, yet historical records are clear that not only did Jefferson not call himself a deist, he called himself a Christian. I am a real Christian, that is to say, a disciple of the doctrines of Jesus. Although Jefferson did call himself a Christian, he would probably fail the standard by any orthodox definition, for he viewed Jesus only as a great teacher and not as divine. Nonetheless, the fact remains that Jefferson did not call himself a deist, he called himself a Christian. Jefferson thought Christianity so important that he personally authored a work for the Indians entitled The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth, which set forth the teachings of Jesus as delivered in the Gospels. While President of the United States, Jefferson even approved several measures appropriating federal funds to pay for Christian missionaries to the Indians. Furthermore, Jefferson signed into law 3 separate acts setting aside government lands for the sole use of Christian missionaries to evangelize the Indians and others.
Jefferson's assault on priestcraft anticipated Paine's in the Age of Reason, but led in a radically different direction. While Paine launched his fusillade at Christianity generally, Jefferson instead focused on church establishments, winning support from Baptists and other dissenters, and by identifying himself with a broad Protestant impulse that transformed the new nation's religious landscape.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Today, many Americans think that the First Amendment says separation of church and state. The courts and the media will often refer to a ruling as being in violation of the separation of church and state. That phrase actually comes from a letter written by President Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association, who were concerned that Anglicanism might become the official or established denominational preference of the new nation. In his own words, this is what he said.
Believing with you that religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God, that he owes account to none other for his faith or his worship, that the legislative powers of government reach actions only and not opinions, I contemplate the sovereign reverence that the act of the whole American people, which declared that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state.
Jefferson was trying to reassure the worried Baptists that no such establishment skullduggery was afoot, as he wrote in notes to the state of Virginia.
The legitimate powers of government extend to such acts only as are injurious to others, but it does me no injury for my neighbor to say that there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg.
The reasonable Jefferson did not mean to endorse either polytheism or atheism, but rather to mark out the boundary between the authority of government and of individual conscience. Baptists and other evangelical opponents of the Anglican establishment understood this. Jefferson was their champion, not an enemy of Christianity.
The words separation, church, and state aren't even mentioned. The phrase wall of separation, so often used by the courts, comes not from the First Amendment, but from the pen of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was in France when the Constitution was drafted, and while he had some influence upon those who wrote the First Amendment, he was not a member of the Congress that passed the First Amendment, nor of any state legislature that ratified it. His wall of separation statement comes from his address to the Danbury Baptist in 1802, 13 years after the passage of the First Amendment and 11 years after its ratification. In no way should this phrase of Jefferson be considered the definitive interpretation of the First Amendment. Far from intending such total separation of religion from government, Congress called upon the President to declare a day of public thanksgiving and prayer, the very day after Congress passed the First Amendment.
The First Amendment's widely misunderstood Establishment Clause simply means that the state will not set up any official state religion, nor will it prohibit any person from freely exercising the religious dictates of his or her own conscience. The restriction on the government's intrusion into the private religious convictions of its citizenry does not mean that all aspects of religion should be kept completely out of the affairs of the state. That secular ideology is entirely foreign to the original intent of the Founding Fathers, who drafted the Constitution, including its Bill of Rights, as a clearly defined limitation on the power of the government to interfere with the freedoms of the people. A godless secular state was not the intentions of the Founding Fathers. They greatly feared this might be a possibility. President Washington left a clear warning against it in his farewell address on September 17, 1796.
Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism, who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician equally with pious man ought to respect and cherish them. Volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. Let it simply be asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule, indeed, extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Who, that is a sincere friend to it, can look with indifference upon attempts to shake the foundation of the fabric? Contrary to their view, the fact that the United States was not founded as a Christian nation was early stated in the terms of a treaty with Tripoli drafted in 1796 under George Washington and signed by John Adams in 1797.
Today's skeptics, neo-Jacobins, and new atheists claim America is not founded upon Christian principles, predictably bring up one particular document, the Treaty of Tripoli. It serves as the foundation for their entire argument. The full text of Article 11 of the treaty states,
As the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, as it has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Mussulmen, and as the said states have never entered into any war or act of hostility against any Mohammedan nation, it is declared by the parties that no pretext arising from religious opinions shall ever produce an interruption of the harmony existing between the two countries.
The one clause in the document stating, as the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, is used to make the whole case against Christianity as the foundational religion of America. The Treaty of Tripoli is consistent with the United States Constitution. Once interpreted correctly, Professor of History Frank Lambert did a phenomenal job in showing the unity of these two historical documents.
Upon close analysis, however, the clause is entirely consistent with the Constitution. 10 years earlier, the delegates to the Constitutional Convention had crafted a secular state, one that established, supported, and defended no religion. Indeed, the end result of the Founding Fathers' deliberations was the acknowledgement that religion was not under government jurisdiction, remaining one of those natural rights that the people retain for themselves. Article 11 of the 1797 treaty affirmed that the government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. Under the Constitution, church and state were separate, but the founders differentiated between the state and the nation. The former was the political power that bound the people together, and the latter was their cultural unity, including their common beliefs, aspirations, and principles. By no means did the separation of church and state mean that Americans were not a religious people, nor did it preclude the possibility that the nation was already or could become a Christian nation, that it would be determined by the voluntary decisions of men and women in a free religious market, not by government coercion.
What led up to the Treaty of Tripoli was the Barbary states of North Africa, Tunis, Morocco, Algiers, Turkey, and Tripoli were in conflict against Christian nations, which included the United States shortly after America won their independence from England. The 5 Barbary nations regularly attack American merchant ships, taking their goods and enslaving the Christian seamen. Families and local church groups often had to participate in fundraising efforts to gather ransoms for captured individuals. The treaty was ratified unanimously by Congress and signed by then President John Adams. It was Adams who declared in a letter to Thomas Jefferson the inspiration behind the independence.
And what were these general principles upon which the founders achieved independence? I answer, the general principles of Christianity, in which all those sects were united, and the general principles of English and American liberty, in which all those young men united, and which had united all parties in America, in majorities sufficient to assert and maintain her independence. Now I will avow that I then believed and now believed that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God, and that those principles of liberty are as unalterable as human nature and our terrestrial mundane system.
First of all, we see that Adams' emphasis of general principles of Christianity indicates that he is trying to make sure that his hearers and readers understood that he was saying that the principles of the founding were principles upon which all denominations of Christians could agree upon. The principles of Christianity were not just according to one denomination. Why did the writers of the treaty say that the United States of America is not founded on the Christian religion when signer of the Declaration of Independence, John Adams, says himself that the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity? Because, as evident from the prohibition of theocracy, America, unlike many of the European nations that had either state-run churches or church-run states, had no theological quarrel with Muslim nations, which were virtually all theocratic. As the last sentence in Article 11 of the treaty states, since America is not a theocracy, they cannot have a state-to-state theological disagreement with these Muslim nations on the basis of religious opinions. Barton also debunks the claims of secularists that America is not a Christian nation because they have a godless constitution. Writing about the Treaty of Tripoli, he concluded,
This article may be read in two manners. It may, as its critics do, be concluded after the clause Christian religion, or it may be read in its entirety and concluded when the punctuation so indicates. But even if shortened and cut abruptly, the government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion. This is not an untrue statement, since it's referring to the federal government. Recall that while the founders themselves openly described America as a Christian nation, they did include a constitutional prohibition against a federal establishment. Religion was a matter left solely to the individual states. Therefore, if the article is read as a declaration that the federal government of the United States was not in any sense founded on the Christian religion, such a statement is not a repudiation of the fact that America was considered a Christian nation. Reading the clause of the treaty in its entirety also fails to weaken this fact. Article 11 simply distinguished America from those historical strains of European Christianity. It simply assured the Muslims that the United States was not a Christian nation like those of previous centuries, with whose practices the Muslims were very familiar, and thus would not undertake a religious holy war against them.
The peaceful state of early America was attributed to the separation of church and state. Tocqueville noted from his investigation into the matter that various denominations were united upon this important point.
As a member of the Roman Catholic Church, I was more particularly brought into contact with several of its priests with whom I became intimately acquainted. To each of these men I expressed my astonishment and I explained my doubts. I found that they differed upon matters of detail alone, and that they mainly attributed the peaceful dominion of religion in their country to the separation of church and state. I do not hesitate to affirm that during my stay in America, I did not meet with a single individual of the clergy or of the laity who was not of the same opinion upon this point.
The new atheists attempt to distort the writings of the founding fathers to make them appear to be skeptics, agnostics, radical deists, or atheists. Dawkins misquotes John Adams as saying,
This would be the best of all possible worlds if there was no religion in it.
Here's the complete quote in an April 19, 1817 letter to Thomas Jefferson.
20 times in the course of my late reading have I been on the point of breaking out, this would be the best of all possible worlds if there was no religion at all. But in this exclamation I would have been as fanatical as Bryant or Cleverly. Without religion, this world would be something not fit to be mentioned in polite company. I mean hell.
In quoting John Adams out of context, Dawkins had made it seem that Adams said exactly opposite of what he really intended. No wonder he left out the part where Adams said that the world would be hell without religion. Adams directly refuted Dawkins' major premise of the book, that religion is the great evil in the world, and affirmed the opposite, that religion keeps the world from becoming completely evil. Dawkins also quotes James Madison out of context.
During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What has been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution.
Anyone who is familiar with the context of this quote would see Dawkins again as being intellectually dishonest by conveniently leaving out the surrounding sentences. He put an atheist coloring on Madison's words. Read in the context of the document, Madison's objection was not to Christianity, but to the establishment of state-sponsored Christianity.
Because experience witnesseth, and ecclesiastical establishments, instead of maintaining the purity and efficacy of religion, have had a contrary operation. During almost 15 centuries has the legal establishment of Christianity been on trial. What has been its fruits? More or less in all places, pride and indolence in the clergy, ignorance and servility in the laity, in both superstition, bigotry, and persecution. Because the establishment in question is not necessary for the support of civil government, if religion be not within the cognizance of civil government, How can its legal establishment be said to be necessary to civil government? What influences, in fact, have ecclesiastical establishments had on civil society? In some instances, they have been seen to erect a spiritual tyranny on the ruins of civil authority. In many instances, they have been seen upholding the thrones of political tyranny. In no instances have they been seen the guardians of the liberties of the people. Rulers who wish to subvert the public liberty may have found in established clergy convenient auxiliaries. A just government instituted to secure and perpetuate it needs them not. Such a government will be best supported by protecting every citizen in the enjoyment of his religion with the same equal hand that protects his person and property, by neither invading the equal rights of any sect nor suffering any sect to invade those of another.
It is clear from the context that Madison objected to the legal establishment of Christianity, not to Christianity itself. The word democracy is a term that comes from the Greek, and it is made up of two other words, demos, people, and kration, to govern, to rule. The source of authority for a democracy is simply the whims, opinions, and fluctuating feelings of the majority. The people are essentially a law to themselves, and the sole source of ascertaining right and wrong. The Bible frequently alludes to this very negative social circumstance.
Thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil, neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many to wrest judgment. O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not in man that walketh to direct his steps. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes.
The founders of America had an incredible and extensive knowledge of ancient Greece and Rome. They sought out books on ancient democracies and republics to learn what worked and what didn't. And the founders read the Greek and Roman classics extensively, even more so than we do today. What is startling to some is the fact that many of the ideas presented in those books were rejected by the founders. Russell Kirk, an American political theorist, argues that the framers of the Constitution inherited more from British culture influenced by the Reformation than from ancient Greece and Rome. He also rejects the promoters of historical revisionism, which states that the founders borrowed much from these early civilizations.
It should be confessed that in some respects our debt to the ancients is not quite so great as certain historians and professors of politics would have us believe. Leading Americans did study closely the old Greek constitutions. In his defense of the Constitutions of Government of the United States of America, published in 1787 on the eve of America's Great Convention, John Adams examines critically 12 ancient democratic republics, 3 ancient aristocratic republics, and 3 ancient monarchical republics, and finds them all inferior to the political system of the new Republic of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay, the authors of the Federalist Papers, often referred to the turbulent democracies of ancient Greece, Madison's phrase, and to other ancient constitutions. In general, those 3 American statesmen found the political systems of Greece and Rome as unfit for the imitation, as they are repugnant to the genius of America. Again, Madison's phrase.
The founding fathers were equally critical of Rome and found little political patrimony. Ancient Rome started off as a republic and slowly degenerated to an empire. The tumultuous transition became a lesson to early American leaders. Kirk continues.
In consequence of the long civil wars of Roman factions in the 1st century before Christ, the Republic fell to be supplanted by the Roman Empire. This Roman experience and the decadence that oppressed Roman civilization as the centuries elapsed were much in the minds of American leaders near the end of the 18th century. The grim consequences of political centralization under the empire did something to discourage the notion of an American government that would be central rather than federal, much as the Greeks' disunity was remarked by some delegates as a warning against leaving the American Republic a mere confederation. Besides, Roman struggles of class against class reminded Americans they must seek to reconcile different classes through their own constitutional structure. Thus, Rome's political and moral example was a cautionary lesson to the Americans of the early republic.
Consider, for example, the writings of an early president of the United States, John Quincy Adams.
Democracy will soon degenerate into an anarchy, such an anarchy that every man will do what is right in his own eyes, and no man's life or property or reputation or liberty will be secure. And every one of these will soon mold itself into a system of subordination of all the moral virtues and intellectual abilities, all the powers of wealth, beauty, wit, and science, to the wanton pleasures, the capricious will, and the execrable, abominable cruelty of one or a very few.
Today, democracy is more akin to a dictatorship, although the people think the power to decide who to vote for radiates from them. In the age of mass propaganda flowing from newspapers, magazines, and television, the elite opinions are programmed into the masses. Wren, after evaluating the democratic agenda, concluded,
In today's Western world, too, the rhetoric of democratization conceals that democracy operates increasingly by central direction. For the most part, the people vote as their leaders, supported by allies in the mass media, want them to vote. Less and less does popular rule mean that people make decisions for themselves in their families, associations, and local communities where they can exercise direct or fairly direct control over their own lives. More and more, popular rule means that they are content to cede such power to leaders and to accept decisions that are made for them at a great distance from their places of life and work. The new Jacobinism is the main ideological and political force behind present efforts to turn democracy into a worldwide moral crusade.
The individual liberated from the bonds of difference to traditional social influences has no more confidence in his own judgments than in those of any other particular person or group or institution, and so effective authority is transferred to some abstract third, public opinion, the state, or history. Tocqueville insists, when the person who inhabits democratic countries compares himself to all those who surround him,
he feels with pride that he is the equal of any one of them, but when he comes to survey the totality of his fellows and to place himself in contrast to so huge a body, he is instantly overwhelmed by the sense of his own insignificance and weakness. The same equality which renders him independent of each of his fellow citizens taken severally exposes him alone and unprotected to the influence of the greater number. The public has therefore among a democratic people a singular power of which aristocratic nations could never so much as conceive.
For Tocqueville, the collapse of all social hierarchy into a homogeneous mass signifies the collapse of all sense of truth, all orientation towards a reality other than the common or average perception, which perception, in turn, since it has no anchor beyond the mass, can only be understood in terms of the greatest power. This Lucifer principle is enslaving humanity, bringing them closer to destruction. Civil government is in contrast to the church established in the New Testament, which was instructed to practice and teach the truth in any society, but not to enforce its practices on others. After all, individual salvation is a matter of the mind, not something that can be forced upon an individual. The Bible instruction is for Christians to pray for a civil government that will allow them to seek godliness in peace.
I exhort, therefore, that first of all, supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty. For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior.
Sometimes, civil governments do exactly that. While God promises to be the leader of the nation that follows him, the Bible teaches a separation of functions between civil government and the priesthood, with the exception that the priesthood was involved in the highest levels of the judicial system. In general, the Bible teaches local leaders appointed by the people, as opposed to the top-down ecclesiastical hierarchy. Both of these principles can be used by secular governments.
Judges and officers shalt thou make thee in all thy gates, which the Lord thy God giveth thee throughout thy tribes, and they shall judge the people with just judgment. Thou shalt not wrest judgment. Thou shalt not respect persons, neither take a gift, for a gift doth blind the eyes of the wise, and pervert the words of the righteous. that which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live, and inherit the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee.
In the case there is any uncertainty as to who the you is that was to appoint the judges and the officers, only 2 verses prior we find you, being people who were to bring offerings to the Lord in proportion to how they have been blessed. It is the working people who are to bring offerings, and they are the ones who are to appoint judges, the judicial system, and officers, the executive branch. It is interesting that the judges and officers were to be in your gates, which refers to the gates of the city, local government, and according to your tribes, which we could compare to the state or regional government. This should be the basis of government. Finally, there was a small place for national government.
If there arise a matter too hard for thee in judgment between blood and blood, between plea and plea, and between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within thy gates, then shalt thou arise, and get thee up into the place which the Lord thy God shall choose. And thou shalt come unto the priests and the Levites, and unto the judge that shall be in those days, and inquire, and they shall shew thee the sentence of judgment.
It is most interesting that the United States of America has local, state, and national governments, as well as local courts, state courts, and national courts. These correspond to the gates, tribes, and the place which the Lord your God chooses, which became Jerusalem, the capital of the nation. America's constitutional framers were Bible readers, and they patterned this and many other laws on Bible principles.
The convention closed the wording of the Constitution with the phrase, "In the year of our Lord, 1787. Unlike the anti-religionists who fomented their French Revolution and changed the calendar to date events before and after the Revolution, the framers of American independence were perfectly willing to recognize the birth of our Lord Jesus Christ as the central event of human history. During the convention itself, the delegates did not regularly quote scripture in the floor debates. They were not a theological debating society. They were practical men gathered for a practical purpose, the drafting of a constitution to create a civil government. But the principles that underlie their discussions and the constitution they created are clearly based on their Christian worldview found in the Bible. As noted earlier, the vast majority of the delegates were active churchmen who were raised on the Bible and who turned to the Bible as their primary source of thought and inspiration.
The Constitution established America as a republic, not a democracy. A republic is a government of law under a constitution. The Constitution holds the government in check and prevents the majority acting through their government from violating the rights of the individual. Under this system of government, a lynch mob is illegal. The suspected criminal cannot be denied his right to a fair trial even if a majority of the citizenry demands otherwise. Professor Francis Beckwith noted that a Republican government need agreed upon religious values to exist.
According to this view, the United States of America is a constitutional republic whose institutions presuppose and entail certain beliefs about the order and nature of conditions necessary for maintaining the continuity and purpose of the nation, including the rights of its people and the powers of its government, both state and federal. The philosophical infrastructure of the American Republic consists of a cluster of ideals, beliefs, practices, and institutions that are best sustained by a people who see this cluster as grounded in certain unchanging moral truths that are religious in nature.
A true Republican government establishes civil righteousness, but is lacking the power to liberate its subjects from sin. This is the purpose of the church, to preach Jesus, the justifier of the ungodly. A professor of constitutional law shows the limits and purpose of government. He cautions his readers that a Republican form of government, without the preaching of the gospel, imperils a nation.
God gave human government the authority to restrain and punish crime, because the root of crime is the sin nature of man. By holding before men the threat of temporal punishment, government can hold man's sin nature in check and can compel men to refrain from criminal acts. But that is all government can do. Government can only restrain sin and promise civil righteousness, and that will only yield partial success. Government cannot eradicate the sin nature or cleanse men from their sins. Only the work of Jesus on Calvary's cross can do this.
In a republic, the rights of all citizens are protected. In a democracy, there is a danger of tyranny from the majority. The belief in one supreme God favors the regular development of the moral ideas in humanity. The connection of moral consciousness with monotheism comes out clearly in American republicanism. Moral consciousness means recognition of law, and law prevails over men so as to influence their conduct much more powerfully when the thought of the sovereign ruler is present. Historian Thomas Vaden shed light on this fact.
Monotheism is preeminently conservative and progressive and has conservative revolutions for her eminent excellent civilization. Of all nations, this has the greatest materials for national exaltation, and to do it effectually, it has to secure the everlasting benefits of monotheism. It has to cherish it with the deepest affection. Mind in its individual capacity is ever to guard for this, for its chief good. How can man ever bear up best and most independently against all the storms of life without this holy protection? How shall the stranger in all the vicissitudes of life meet all arising difficulties without proper references founded on an appropriate deportment? The American mind should seek that which ennobles and makes wise and imparts popular confidence. Monotheism honors every honorable draft, meets all the requisitions of mind, refers universally to universal relations, and meets universal obligations. While the crowning triumph of republicanism is monotheism, exalting Americans free and happy to be men as monotheists, seeing the loveliness of their constitutional government that is most closely allied to their greatest temporal advantages, yet should they forego the highest obligations of a proper international code, they may alienate too extensively their future permanency.
Illuminism is the material manifestation of Lucifer's war against Christ Jesus. Pantheism materializes God and makes God and the universe one. God is merely the total of all that exists. The universe is a great inclusive unity that devours God in that unity. The universe becomes God, and nothing separate or distinct exists from this universe God. The universe becomes the sole reality. It deifies unregenerated man. Democracy finds a home in this philosophy. Tocqueville discovered pantheism is the philosophy that will seduce the democratic heart and is the thing subconsciously yearned for. A philosophy that prepares men for despotism and a willing surrender of individual liberty to the comfort of seemingly total equality.
It cannot be denied that pantheism has made great progress in our age. If there be a philosophical system which teaches that all things material and immaterial, visible and invisible, which the world contains, are only to be considered as the several parts of an immense being, which alone remains unchanged amid the continual change and ceaseless transformation of all that constitute it, we may readily infer that such a system, although it destroys the individuality of man, nay, rather because it destroys that individuality, will have secret charms for men living in democracies. All their habits of thought prepare them to conceive it and predispose them to adopt it. It naturally attracts and fixes their imagination. It fosters the pride while it soothes the indolence of their minds. Among the different systems by whose aid philosophy endeavors to explain the universe, I believe pantheism to be one of those most fitted to seduce the human mind in democratic ages.
As we see in Volume 1 and 2 of this DVD series, the preservation of Christianity as a positive religion is essential for avoiding the abyss of pantheism. The French revolutionary government was not a true republic, despite its appellation, but violent democracy in action, degenerating brutality, and chaotically into mob rule. The revolutionists, led by Marat, Danton, Saint Just, Herbert, Robespierre, unleashed a horrible scarlet monster, a monster that, in the end, they could not control. The word democracy appears nowhere in the Declaration of Independence of the Constitution, the two most fundamental documents of America. Instead of democracy, the Constitution's Article 4, Section 4, guarantees to every state in this union a republican form of government. The following quotations demonstrate the disdain the founders held for democracy. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, signers of the Declaration of Independence, warn about the dangers of democracy.
Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There is never a democracy that did not commit suicide. Democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. Liberty is a well-armed lamb contesting the vote.
James Madison, recognized as the father of the U.S. Constitution, said this about factions and democracy in Federalist Number 10.
A pure democracy, a common passion or interest will, in almost every case, be felt by a majority of the whole. Such governments have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property. This species of government have erroneously supposed that they be reducing mankind to a perfect equality in their political rights. They would, at the same time, be perfectly equalized and assimilated in their possessions, their opinions, and their passions.
James and Walker Kennedy correctly perceived the present danger of rejecting Madison's warning and commented,
Note Madison's warning that the majority of the whole would use the force of government to oppress property rights. He also warned that when people operate in groups, mobs or government, their emotions and passions tend toward the lowest common denominator of the group. It should be of no surprise that mass democracies always denigrate into governments that actively seek to redistribute wealth in order to assure that no one has too much and that everyone in society has their fair share. Parallel to the urge to equalize wealth, mass democracies also attempt to enforce the lowest form of social morality, regardless of how far removed it is from biblical views.
Monotheism, the belief in one God who is the creator of the universe, the father of all humanity, and the source for all absolute standard of morality, is the single greatest contribution to civilization in the history of mankind. The spirit of republicanism is the Holy Spirit that resides in the hearts of a people and a country who honor God and His law. According to founder Noah Webster,
our citizens should early understand that the genuine source of correct Republican principles is the Bible, particularly the New Testament or the Christian religion.
Natural law and virtue were closely identified in the revolutionary mind, since God and nature told men not only what they had a right to do, but what was right for them to do. The practice of virtue was simply obedience to natural law. It was the business of educators and ministers to instruct their charges that the fairest right of all was to do what was right, that true liberty was the liberty to follow God's plan for human happiness. Alexander Hamilton, signer of the Constitution, echoed that theme.
The law, dictated by God Himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding over all the globe, in all countries, and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this.
The foremost legal authority of the Founders' Day was William Blackstone, introduced in 1766. Blackstone's commentaries on the laws became the legal guidebook of early American leaders. Blackstone's commentaries, in fact, formed the basis of American law until 1920, considered authoritative even in the United States Supreme Court. Commenting on the need to keep our laws consistent with God's laws, Blackstone states,
Man, considered as a creature, must necessarily be subject to the laws of his Creator, for he is entirely a dependent being, and consequently, as man depends absolutely upon his Maker for everything, it is necessary that he should, in all points, conform to his Maker's will. The will of his Maker is called the law of nature. This law of nature, being coeval with mankind and dictated by God Himself, is of course superior in obligation to any other. It is binding all over the globe in all countries and at all times. No human laws are of any validity if contrary to this, and such of them as are valid derive all their force and all their authority, mediately or immediately, from this original. The doctrines thus delivered we call the revealed or divine law, and they are to be found only in the Holy Scriptures. These precepts, when revealed, are found upon comparison to be really a part of the original law of nature, as they tend in all their consequences to man's felicity. Upon these two foundations, the law of nature and the law of revelation, depend all human laws. That is to say, no human laws should be suffered to contradict these.
When the founding fathers of America established the United States, they did so with a firm reliance on Almighty God. The majority were Christians, educated in Christian environments, and they were newly freed from the tyranny of Britain's king and monarchy control. While they believed in government, they also maintained a healthy distrust of government as an entity. The battle cry of the American Revolution was, "No king but King Jesus." They distrusted man as a whole. The reason for their distrust was biblically centered. Among the scriptures they consulted, they discovered Jeremiah chapter 17 verse 9, which says,
"The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it?"
They knew the heart of man was in need of Christ's redemption. Pride and narcissism corrupted men and government at every level. So, they established checks and balances. James Madison, who probably inspired the Constitution more than any other single person, echoed a similar theme.
But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself.
The separation of powers devised by the framers of the Constitution was designed to do one primary thing: to prevent the majority from ruling with an iron fist. Based on the experience, the framers shied away from giving any branch of the new government too much power. The separation of powers provides a system of shared power known as checks and balances. There are three branches in the United States government as established by the Constitution. First, the legislative branch makes the law. Second, the executive branch executes the law. Last, the judicial branch interprets the law. Each branch has an effect upon the other. These principle of the three separation of powers of government has biblical origins. In the Hebrew Republic, as in America, there were three branches of government controlled by God: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial.
For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king. He will save us.
As a God-fearing nation, America's founding fathers created a constitution that protected the rights of the people. American writer Gary DeMar contends with evidence that the idea for the Constitution was inspired by the Bible.
As was the case when our nation was founded, God was acknowledged as supreme sovereign. His laws were law, spiritual and civil. They were the fundamental for laws and statutes enacted. Each of the 12 tribes was sovereign in its own right. The 12 were a union under God. There was unity in God and in matters of national import. Yet no tribe or tribes could trespass on the sovereignty of others. Within this structure and at every level, the Lord God provided for a system of checks and balances, being aware of the sinful nature of man. The authority of the judges was checked by the Senate of tribal leaders or princes. The power of the senatorial council was checked by the power of the judicial and the people. And the whole was under the restraint and constraint of divine constitution, the laws of God. When God permitted the people to have an earthly king, that king was required to write him a copy of this law in a book and read therein all the days of his life.
In fact, the Bible was used to structure government and segregate its authority into different levels. In Exodus chapter 18, Moses' father-in-law Jethro counseled him to distribute his leadership duties. Moses appointed leaders over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. The difficult cases still came to Moses, but most issues were handled at much lower levels. There was a religious element to the American Revolution, which was so pronounced that you could just as well view the event in religious as in political terms. Every unbiased student of American history would come to this conclusion.
Proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof.
Modern secularists believe that the idea of a self-evident human equality that pervades the United States Declaration of Independence came primarily from the agnostic intellectuals of the French Enlightenment, and that the theistic sentiments expressed by Jefferson and other founders were mere rhetoric, designed to curry favor with Christian colonists. But nothing could be further from the truth. While some of the founders like Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin were not Orthodox Christians by any stretch of the imagination, neither were they atheists.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
The unalienable rights that the Declaration specifically mentions are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Why are these rights unalienable? Because they were given to the people by God. They were endowed by their Creator. These words from the Declaration of Independence of the United States of America are foundational to their nation. They do not declare that their rights come from the government, as many today seem to believe. They declare that God, the Creator of the universe, endows us with these rights, and that the government, by their consent, is to ensure these rights are inviolable, particularly that our individual liberty is not violated by the government itself. The document also states that these rights are self-evident and that they constitute the laws of nature. These principles are taken directly from the Bible. The law of nature can be viewed in Romans chapter 2 verse 14 to 16.
For when the Gentiles, which have not the law, do by nature the things contained in the law, these, having not the law, are a law unto themselves, which shew the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts the mean, while accusing or else excusing one another, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel.
That our Creator is the author of life is seen in Genesis chapter 2 verse 7.
And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul.
That God, not government, grants liberty is seen in Luke chapter 4 verse 18 and Galatians chapter 5 verse 1.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised. Stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage.
The pursuit of happiness is found in Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verse 13.
And also that every man should eat and drink and enjoy the good of all his labor. It is the gift of God.
Any true study of liberty must begin with an examination of spiritual liberty, or the salvation wrought through Jesus Christ. Or spiritual liberty is the foundation of individual, family, and even political liberty.
In the political sense, it means freedom from slavery or servanthood, or national freedom from a foreign power.
For this liberty to be functional and sustained, since it is based on God's Word, we have to understand what the Bible meant by liberty. Freedom is the ability to know the truth and comply with its demands.
And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free.
The biblical idea of liberty is a liberty rooted in spiritual freedom.
For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's.
Christian teaching relates true freedom to the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage.
This freedom is effected for the believer by the Holy Spirit.
Now the Lord is that Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty.
A false teaching about liberty would lead us into bondage. Satan inspired false brethren to substitute the freedom in Christ for another that would facilitate his wiles.
And that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage.
In scripture, the word flesh is sometimes used to denote corrupt human nature and not merely the body. There is freedom from slavery to sin as a dominating principle in our nature.
Jesus answered them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, whosoever committeth sin is the servant of sin. For, brethren, ye have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion to the flesh, but by love serve one another.
Benjamin Rush similarly observed,
Where there is no law, there is no liberty, and nothing deserves the name of law but that which is certain and universal in its operation upon all the members of the community.
The description of this deliverance as a redemption introduces the idea of new ownership. Christian freedom represents autonomy from Satan and his false gods, but not to God.
But I say, the things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to devils and not to God. And I would not that ye should have fellowship with devils. Ye cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of devils. Ye cannot be partakers of the Lord's table and of the table of devils. For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's.
When Frenchman Alexis de Tocqueville visited the United States during the early 19th century, he had an advantage of looking back on the recent French Revolution and comparing it to what he was learning about the American Revolution. In his book entitled Democracy in America, Tocqueville warned his countrymen of the perils of attempting a republican form of government without the supports of Christianity. What makes Tocqueville's account memorable is the way in which he grasped the moral content of America. Coming from a country where the abuse of power by the clergy had made anti-clericalism endemic, he was amazed to find a country where it was virtually unknown. He saw, for the first time, Christianity presented not as a totalitarian society, but as an unlimited society, a competitive society, intimately wedded to the freedom and market system of the secular world.
In France, I had almost always seen the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom pursuing courses diametrically opposed to each other. But in America, I found that they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the same country.
We all know persons without religious belief who nonetheless display some virtues we associate with religious teachings. That might seem to suggest that religion is unnecessary to morality, but the counter-argument is that such people are living on the moral capital of prior religious generations. Since secular habituation is grounded only in tradition, that moral capital will be used up eventually, having nothing to replenish it, and we would see a culture such as in revolutionary France and the one we are presently experiencing.
The values of the West are based on Christianity. Some of these values seem to have taken a life of their own, and this gives us the illusion that we can get rid of Christianity and keep the values. True, values like equal dignity and equal rights will persist for a period out of sheer unthinking habit, but their influence will erode. Unfortunately for the critics of Christianity, even values they care about will, according to Nietzsche, eventually collapse. Consider our beliefs in human equality and the value of human life. We may say we believe in human equality, but why do we hold this belief? It is the product of the Christian idea of the spiritual equality of souls. We may insist we believe that all human life has dignity and value, but this too is the outgrowth of a Christian tradition in which each person is the precious creation of God. There is no secular basis for these values, and when secular writers defend them, they always employ unrecognized Christian assumptions.
More often, liberty is equated with democracy or majority rule. It is defined as political freedom or freedom from dictatorial rule. While political liberty is good, it is a great mistake to equate liberty with raw democracy, which is a dictatorship of the masses. Both the antinomian concepts of liberty and liberty as democracy have one thing in common. They both embrace human autonomy or freedom from God and His law word. Both make man the measure of all things, and both lead men directly into bondage to sin and slavery to others. It was the Enlightenment thinkers and the French philosophers who began the redefinition of liberty and its separation from the religious foundation which liberty as privilege had enjoyed. The French Revolution greatly advanced the new meaning. Its slogan was liberty, fraternity, and equality. It soon became apparent that all three had new, ugly, and murderous meaning. It was apparent to Tocqueville that the underlying principle of French secular, deistic, atheistic, and pantheistic politics was corrosive to the often mentioned liberty.
At the time the French conceived a desire for political liberty, they were imbued with a number of notions on the subject of government, which were not only difficult to reconcile with liberty, but were almost hostile to it.
Madame Roland was the most powerful woman in Paris after the execution of Louis XVI. Together with her husband Jean-Marie Roland, was a supporter of the French Revolution and influential member of the Girondist faction. She fell out of favor during the Reign of Terror and died on the guillotine. She was executed on November 8, 1793. Her last words are,
"O liberty, what crimes are committed in your name?"
Professor Frank Manuel saw liberty manipulated to mean license to introduce a new form of evil.
The very term liberty lost its medieval connotation of a privilege and became the right to bring into being what had not existed before.
The scarlet-colored beast, camouflaged itself dressed in liberty, brought chaos to the world. American liberty is not Jacobin liberty. By our lack of discernment, we are drawn into the web of Satan's enticement. The Declaration of Rights of the French Revolution set forth the new meaning of freedom. Liberty consists in being allowed to do whatever does not injure other people. If this definition sounds familiar, it is because it has been the premise behind the sexual revolution, pornography, homosexual rights movement, pedophilia, abortion, and a variety of so-called victimless crimes. The principles of the Bible are the groundwork of human freedom, but with the Bible repudiated or unknown, what protection has the modern world against idiotic superstitions, mass hysteria, and civil and religious tyranny? The French Revolution, which our world is repeating seriatim, shows that there is no protection under such circumstances. Religion and liberty were understood by the founders to be linked in important ways. In reflecting on the spirit of 1776 late in his life, John Adams pointedly summarized matters in a letter to Thomas Jefferson.
The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the only principles in which that beautiful assembly of young gentlemen, representing the numerous religious denominations of the country at the time of the Revolution, could unite. And what were these general principles? I answer, the general principles of Christianity, in which all those sects were united, and the general principles of English and American liberty, in which all those young men united, and which had united all parties in America, in majorities sufficient to assert and maintain her independence. Now I will avow that I then believed and now believe that those general principles of Christianity are as eternal and immutable as the existence and attributes of God, and those principles of liberty are as unalterable as human nature and our terrestrial, mundane system.
In a letter to a member of the National Assembly, Edmund Burke, a British statesman, political theorist, and philosopher, wrote,
What is liberty without virtue? It is the greatest of all possible evils. It is madness without restraint. Men are qualified for civil liberty in exact proportion to their disposition to put moral chains upon their own appetite. Society cannot exist unless a controlling power upon will and appetite be placed somewhere. And less of it there is within, the more of it there must be without.
Unfortunately, America's government has long thrown off those constitutional chains, resulting in its cancerous growth, massive welfare state, ruinous public debt, and freedom-destroying intrusions into every area of the lives of its citizens. The original American spirit is based on freedom through the virtues of the family and marriage, and yes, the church, coupled with self-reliance on one hand and a sense of volunteerism on the other hand. It looks to God. the family, the church, and private initiative, and ambition as the prime move of society, and sees every citizen as a culture creator, responsible both for their own welfare and how their actions impact their family, their community, and their nation.
The decentralization that is characteristic of Western constitutional democracy reflects a particular understanding of human nature and morality. That understanding is deeply rooted Christian ideas of community. Traditional Western morality creates a strong presumption that man's primary moral obligation is to deal with problems at close range, starting with self. The individual is acutely aware of his own weaknesses, aware that much needs to be done to remedy them. Doing well with family, kindred, friends, and colleagues is in itself a demanding task. If this task does not consume the energy of the individual, other heavy and pressing responsibilities await most human beings rather close to home and workplace. These should be attended to before presuming to tell people at a great distance how to live. We demonstrate our capacity for humanity in acts of character, and chiefly within the concrete relationships of daily life. This attitude has been a central feature of the ethos of the decentralized society.
John Locke is remembered today largely as a political philosopher. He preached the doctrine that men naturally possess certain large rights, the chief being life, liberty, and property. Rulers, he said, derive their power only from the consent of the people. He taught that government should be like a contract between the rulers and his subjects. The people give up certain of their rights in return for a just rule, and the ruler should hold his power only so long as he uses it justly. These views were most fully developed in Locke's famous second treatise concerning civil government, and they were so radical that he never dared sign his name to it. He acknowledged authorship only in his will. The American Declaration of Independence clearly reflects Locke's teachings.
I will not dispute now whether princes are exempt from the laws of their country, but of this I am sure, they owe subjection to the laws of God and nature. Nobody, no power can exempt them from the obligations of that eternal law. Those are so great and so strong in the case of promise that omnipotency itself can be tied by them. In the Bible, grants, promises, and oaths are bonds that hold the Almighty, whatever some flatterers say to princes of the world, who all together with their people joined to them, are in comparison to the great God, but as a drop of the bucket or a dust on the balance, inconsiderable, nothing.
Thomas Jefferson ranked Locke, along with Locke's compatriot Algernon Sidney, as the most important thinkers on liberty. From Locke, James Madison drew his most fundamental principles of liberty and government. Locke's writings were part of Benjamin Franklin's self-education, and John Adams believed that both girls and boys should learn about Locke. God is committed to protecting any country who reverence his laws.
If my people, which are called by my name, shall humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and will forgive their sin and will heal their land. And it shall come to pass that thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and statutes which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee, and overtake thee. The Lord shall send upon thee cursing, vexation, and rebuke, in all that thou settest thine hand unto for to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly, because of the wickedness of thy doings, whereby thou hast forsaken me.
On this foundation, the Christian community must revive the doctrine of liberty as a religious privilege and immunity. The claims of the state to be the source of freedom are false and evil. The decline of true Christian liberty began when the Enlightenment ideas of natural religion infiltrated the church and replaced the biblical doctrine with the new ideas of natural liberty. When freedom lost its Christian definition, man became a new definer. Previously, God's law and sovereignty set boundaries on man's power. Man was not free from flagrant sins and breaches of liberty prior to the Enlightenment, but he knew that in all these things he was a sinner. Now, with humanism, he was a new God, finding and expressing himself in his autonomous powers. The modern state, as the collective expression of these powers, was liberated to be humanity's new God walking on earth. We learn from the French Revolution that forced egalitarianism lead to oppression, despite the assertion that equates liberty with equality. The fact is, one can have personal liberty and equality of opportunity and equality before the law, blind justice. But you cannot have both liberty and equality of outcome. Liberty entails personal choice, as well as a social and economic freedom that inherently produce differences in outcome, inequalities. The French revolutionists never understood that. The French Revolution began by asserting that rights, rather than being God-given, arose from the state. It ended up producing interludes of terror and totalitarian spoliation, the likes of which the world had never before witnessed, and finally imposed on the French people a dictator far more severe than any of their recent monarchs. Yet none of these excesses were the result of idealism gone wrong, as has been so frequently maintained. They were instead the logical outgrowth of a radical secular and egalitarian philosophy that saw man and the state as God. America's leaders are following the same Luciferian script with a more diabolical outcome, as the Bible warns about Satan's stealthy tactics in a parable. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat and went his way. Gruesome, still one cannot help but draw subtle parallels between some of the events that unfolded during the French Revolution and the authoritarian, secular and collectivist tendencies that had gradually, almost imperceptibly, crept into the American Republic. This has taken place in contemporary American society in the name of social liberal democracy and in the atmosphere of social egalitarian collectivism. The underlying engine, once again, the incitement of the politics of envy, demands for wealth redistribution, and the concomitant calls for more growth in the size, power, and scope of the already behemoth federal government. Author and political commentator James Bovard correctly observes that
Americans' liberty is perishing beneath the constant growth of government power. Federal, state, and local governments are confiscating citizens' property, trampling their rights, decimating their opportunities more than ever before. Americans today must obey 30 times as many laws as their great-grandfathers had to obey at the turn of the century. Federal agencies publish an average of over 200 pages of new rulings, regulations, and proposals in the Federal Register each business day. The growth of the federal statute book is one of the clearest measures of the increase of government control of the citizenry. But the effect to improve society by the endless multiplication of penalties, prohibitions, and prison sentences is a dismal failure.
Many students of history concluded former President George Bush was not a conservative. Professor Claes Rinn rightly called him a Jacobin nationalist. Rinn made it clear in his book, America the Virtuous, The Crisis of Democracy and the Quest for Empire. The neoconservatives are neo-Jacobins.
Though most well-educated Americans are only vaguely aware of it, the government of the United States is heavily influenced by an ideology for global reconstruction that assumes America's moral superiority and right to take charge of the needed changes. On what it considers moral grounds, this ideology mandates worldwide adoption of democracy, freedom, equality, and capitalism. This mandate provides a justification for throwing off traditional restraints on the will to power and for exercising American power on the largest possible scale. People whom the ideology defines as virtuous are entitled to rule the world for its benefit. According to this ideology, the United States is no ordinary nation. It is based on universal principles, the principles of all mankind. It has a higher responsibility and mission than all other countries. The United States is properly humanity's moral and political leader, the arbiter of good and evil in the world. This vision amounts to a new myth of America, the United States as the ruler of a virtuous empire.
An important milestone in the protection of personal liberties was the development of a writing of habeas corpus. Magna Carta, and habeas corpus not only are very important legal concepts in the English-speaking world, but also have had an important impact worldwide. The writing of habeas corpus was and is a safeguard against the illegal or improper holding of a person against his or her will. The American founding fathers guaranteed the right of habeas corpus in the U.S. Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 of the U.S. Constitution provides that
the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it.
In his speech before a military audience in Virginia, President Barack Obama boasted of the role of the CIA and the U.S. Special Operations Units in the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, a 40-year-old New Mexico-born Muslim cleric. It marked the first time in history that an American president has publicly applauded the government's assassination of a U.S. citizen who, in Awlaki's case, has never been charged or indicted for any crime, much less tried and convicted in a court of law. The New York Times reported,
the Obama administration's secret legal memorandum that opened the door to the killing of Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born radical Muslim cleric hiding in Yemen, found that it would be lawful only if it were not feasible to take him alive, according to people who have read the document. The memo, written last year, followed months of extensive interagency deliberations. It offers a glimpse into the legal debate that led to one of the most significant decisions made by President Obama, to move ahead with the killing of an American citizen without a trial. The secret document provided the justification for acting despite an executive order banning assassinations, a federal law against murder, protections in the Bill of Rights, and various strictures of the international laws of war, according to people familiar with the analysis.
Governmental assassination is always preceded and justified by demonizing their targets. Angie Carlson lists a few examples proving that the American government is continuing the tradition of the French Revolution.
Here are but a few notable cases of U.S. conditioning. The cold-blooded massacres by government forces of the several dozen at Waco, including 19 children, and of Gordon Kahl, a tax protester who never hurt anyone. Then, Randy Weaver's wife, 13-year-old son and friend living in the countryside of Ruby Ridge, Idaho, to themselves, were massacred by a government sharpshooter in a sting operation gone awry. The mother, as she was cradling her infant daughter at the doorstep, was shot to death for no real reason whatsoever. Members in the first group were dehumanized with the branding of child molester, weirdos, extremists, a cult for weeks on end. The propaganda machine all around the nation at its most shrill pounded out the long-engineered tactics of dehumanization and denigration. That terror was justified largely in the minds of the public and forgotten quite quickly. The others were branded extremists and thoroughly dehumanized. They too are forgotten. There are many more guinea pigs. This sort of example to the nation of cold-blooded punishments took place before the reign of terror in France, a good learning platform of tyrants today.
The attack on individual rights due to the redefining the Constitution reduces America into slavery. Bovard lists a few examples of draconian laws that are instituted by the neo-Jacobins today.
Nowadays, a citizen's use of his own property is presumed illegal unless approved by multiple zoning and planning commissions. Government redevelopment officials confiscate large chunks of cities to allow them to reap a windfall profit. Since 1985, federal, state, and local governments have seized the property of over 200,000 Americans under asset forfeiture laws, often with no more evidence of wrongdoing than an unsubstantiated assertion made by an anonymous government informant. Privacy is vanishing beneath the rising flood tide of government power. Government officials have asserted a de facto right to search almost anybody, almost any time, on almost any pretext. The average American now has far less freedom from having government officials strip search his children, rummage through his luggage, ransack his house, sift through his bank records, and trespass in his fields.
The long list of laws and regulations by the governments continues. This is the democracy neo-Jacobins in America is transplanting around the world. The French Revolution provided the first uses of the words terrorists and terrorism. Use of the word terrorism began in 1795 in reference to the Reign of Terror, initiated by the revolutionary government, the agents of the Committee of Public Safety, and the National Convention that enforced the policies of the terror were referred to as terrorists. Under the dictatorship of Robespierre and Danton, tens of thousands were arrested and thousands were executed. The French Revolution provided an example to future states in oppressing their populations.
Liberty in France had to be equated with equality, or else. In the United States today, as disparity between income groups becomes great, the intellectuals of the now embedded and sanctioned politically correct dogma preach their offshoot of liberty, equality, fraternity, or death, regardless of the contradictions with reality. Before the punishment of death figures in the equation, first must come what we now have in the legion of hate crime/thought laws in their many deceptive forms, with accompanying detention camps where advised that are built by Homeland Security to house the tens of thousands of illegal immigrants who will flood our nation. A Homeland Security high-tech surveillance police state must stand to protect us against terrorists, and that is in its advancing stage. These laws grow in number, and several are now well established in law, like the over 1,000-page Patriot Act, with its twisted, bureaucratic, unreadable codes and punishments, with a title couched in patriotic-sounding abbreviations. These similar preparatory events occurred first before the Reign of Terror in France. Resistors and those who looked like resistors were placed in France's version of detention centers. Horrible garrisons of raw cruelty like Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib, with no right to due course of law, or to even challenge their detention and guilt before conviction or years of detention without trial. People in France grew used to unlawfulness by governing bodies. They have in the U.S. also, and that's before matters become much worse in the U.S., like after a nuclear blast or pandemic.